Buandulino resumed covering her with kisses, moving from her lips to her neck, then her shoulders, while he slowly slipped off her robe, baring her breasts, plunged his face between them, and with his hands continued slipping the robe down over her hips. He felt the taut little belly, he touched her navel, felt, before he was expecting it, the soft down that concealed her supreme boon. She was whispering, calling him, my Eon, my tyrant, my abyss, my Ogdode, my Plarum. Buandulino thrust his hands under the robe still concealing her, and felt that the down that had seemed to herald her sex grew thicker, covered the beginning of her leg, the inner part of the thigh, extended towards the buttocks. Master Nikitas, I tore off her robe, and I saw, from the belly down, Hypatia had goat-like forms, and her legs ended in a pair of ivory-colored hoofs. Suddenly I understood why, concealed by her robe that touched the ground, she didn't seem to walk like someone putting down feet, but moved lightly, as if she didn't move on the earth. And I realized who the fecundators were. They were the satyrs who were never seen, with horned human heads and ram's body, the satyrs who for centuries had lived in the service of the Hypatias, giving them the females and rearing their own males, the latter with their same horrible face, the former still recalling the Egyptian loveliness of the beautiful Hypatia, the ancient, and of her first pupils. How horrible, Nikitas said. Horrible? No, what I felt wasn't horror. Surprise, yes, but only for one instant. Then I decided. My body decided for my soul, or my soul decided for my body. What I saw and touched was very beautiful, because it was Hypatia, and even her feline nature was part of her grace. That pelt, soft and curly, was the most desirable thing I had ever desired. Scented of musk, those limbs of hers, hidden at first, had been designed by an artist's hand, and I wanted that creature with her forest bomb, and I would have loved Hypatia even if she had had the features of a chimera, an ichneumon, a cerastes. So it was that Hypatia and Buandulino were united, until sunset, and when they were exhausted, they lay one beside the other, stroking each other and calling each other by the most tender appellatives, heedless of all that surrounded them. Hypatia said, my soul has fled like a gust of fire. I feel as if I were part of the starry vault. She could not cease exploring the body of her beloved. How beautiful you are, Buandulino. But you men are also monsters, she teased. Your legs are long and white, without fur, and your feet are as big as two skiapods. But you are beautiful all the same, indeed, more beautiful. He kissed her eyes in silence. Do the females of men also have legs like yours? She asked, frowning. Have you felt ecstasy beside creatures with legs like ours? I didn't know that you existed, my love. I don't want you ever again to look at the legs of the females of men. He kissed her hoofs in silence. It was growing dark, and they had to separate. I believe, Hypatia whispered, grazing his lips again, I will tell my companions nothing. Perhaps they wouldn't understand, they don't know that there exists also this way to rise higher. Until tomorrow, my love. Did you hear? I have called you as you called me? I will wait for you. In this way several months went by, the sweetest and purest of my life. I went to her every day and, when I couldn't, the faithful Gavagai acted as our go-between. I was hoping the Huns would never arrive and that this waiting at Pindapedzum would last until my death and beyond. But I felt as if I had defeated death. And then, one day, after many months had passed, when she had given herself with the usual ardor and they were calm again, Hypatia said to Buandulino, something is happening to me. I know what it is, because I've heard the confidences of my companions when they came back from their night with the fecundators. I believe I have a child in my belly. At that moment Buandulino was filled only with an ineffable joy and kissed that belly of hers, blessed by God or by the archons, he didn't much care which. Then he became worried. Hypatia wouldn't be able to conceal her condition from the community. What would she do? I will confess the truth to the mother, she said. She will understand. Something decided that what the others do with the fecundators I would do with you. It was right, according to the good part of nature. She won't be able to reproach me. But for 9 months you will be held by the community, and afterwards I will never be able to see the infant that is born. I will come here for a long time still. It will take many days before my belly is very swollen and everyone realizes. It's only in the last weeks that we won't see each other when I will tell the mother everything. As for the child, if it's a male it will be given to you, and if female, it will be none of your concern. So nature wills. So wills that asshole of a demiurge of yours and those half-goats you live with. Buandulino cried, beside himself. The child is mine, female or male as may be. How beautiful you are, Buandulino, when you fly into a rage, even though you never should, she said, kissing his nose. Don't you realize? After a Hypatia has given birth, she never sees the fecundator again. Isn't this, in your Hypatia's view, what nature wants? She had realized as much only at this moment, and she began to cry, with little moans, as when she made love, her head bowed on the chest of her man, as she clasped his arms and he felt her throbbing breast against him. Buandulino caressed her, spoke tender words into her ear, and then made what seemed to him the only sensible suggestion. Hypatia should flee with him. At her frightened look, he told her that, in doing so, she wouldn't be betraying her community. She had simply been designated with a different privilege, and her duty became different. He would take her to a distant kingdom, and there she would create a new colony of Hypatias. She would simply have made more fertile the seed of their remote mother. She would carry her message elsewhere, except that he would live at her side and would found a new colony of fecundators, in the form of man, as the fruit of their viscera would probably be. In running away you're not doing anything evil, he told her. On the contrary, you are spreading good. Then I will ask permission of the mother. Wait, I don't know yet what sort of person this mother is. Let me think. We'll go to her together. I'll be able to convince her. Give me a few days to think up the right way. My love, I don't want never to see you again. Hypatia was sobbing. I'll do what you wish. I will pass as a female of men. I will come with you to that new city you have told me of. I will behave like the Christians. I will say that God had a son who died on a cross. If you are not here, I don't want to be a Hypatia anymore. Calm yourself, beloved. I'll find a solution. Wait and see. I had Charlemagne made a saint. I rediscovered the Magi. I'll find a way to keep my bride. Bride? What's that? I'll teach you in time. Go now, it's late. We'll see each other tomorrow. There was no tomorrow, Master Nikitas. When I went back to Pindapedzum, they all came rushing towards me. They had been seeking me for hours. All doubt was gone. The white Huns were arriving. At the far horizon you could glimpse the dust cloud raised by their horses. They would reach the edge of the plain of ferns by the first light of dawn. So we had only a few hours left to organize our defense. I went at once to the deacon, to announce that I was assuming command of his subjects. Too late. Those months of anxious waiting for the battle, the effort it had cost him to remain standing and participate in the undertaking, perhaps even the new vigor that I had infused into his veins with my stories, all had hastened his end. I was not afraid to remain close to him as he was breathing his last. Indeed, I clasped his hand as he bade me farewell and wished me victory. He told me that, if I were to win, I would perhaps be able to reach the kingdom of his father, and therefore he begged me to do him a last service. As soon as he was dead, his two veiled acolytes would prepare his corpse as if it were that of a priest, anointing his body with those oils that would imprint his image on the linen in which he would be wrapped. I was to take that portrait to the priest, and pale as he might seem, he would show himself to his adoptive father less destroyed than he was. He died a little later, and the two acolytes did what had to be done. They said the sheet would require some hours to become impregnated with his features, and they would then roll it up and place it in a case. They shyly suggested I inform the eunuchs of the death of the deacon. I resolved not to do so. The deacon had invested me with the command, and thanks to that distinction the eunuchs would not dare disobey me. They had somehow to collaborate in the war, preparing the city to receive the wounded. If they were to know immediately of the deacon's death, at the very least they would have troubled the spirit of the fighters, spreading the fatal news, and distracting them with funeral rites. At most, treacherous as they were, they might immediately assume supreme power and at the same time upset all the poet's defense plans. To war then, I said to myself. Even though I had always been a man of peace, now it was a matter of defending the child that was to be born. 35. Buandulino against the White Huns. They had studied the plan for months, down to the slightest detail. If the poet, in training his troops, had proved himself a good captain, Buandulino had revealed gifts as a strategist. Immediately, at the edges of the city, rose the tallest of those hills like heaps of whipped cream, which they had observed on arriving. From up there you dominated the entire plain, as far as the mountains to one side and beyond the expanse of ferns. From there Buandulino and the poet would direct the movements of their warriors. Beside them, a select troop of skiapods, trained by Gavagai, would allow rapid communication with the various squads. The ponces would be dispersed in different parts of the plain, ready to perceive, with their highly sensitive ventral member, the adversary's movements and to send, as had been agreed, smoke signals. In front of all the others, almost at the far edge of the plain, the skiapods were to wait, under the command of Porcelli, ready to emerge suddenly, confronting the invaders with their fistulas and their poisoned darts. After the enemy columns had been caught off guard by that first impact, behind the skiapods the giants would appear, led by Ilaramo Scotchabarosi known as Bonehead, destroying the invaders' horses. But, the poet urged, until they received the order to go into action, the giants were to advance on all fours. If a part of the enemy forces were to get past the deployment of giants, then the pygmies would enter action under Boidi from one side of the plain, and, from the other the Blemier led by Kutika. Driven in one direction by the hail of the pygmies' arrows, the Huns would move towards the Blemier and, before discerning them in the grass, the defenders could slip under the enemy's horses. Each, however, was to avoid running great risk. They were to inflict severe losses on the enemy, but confine their own to the minimum. In fact, the real backbone of the strategy was the Nubians, who were to wait, in formation, in the center of the plain. The Huns would surely win the first skirmishes, but they would be already reduced in number when they came up against the Nubians, and would be covered with wounds, their horses prevented by the high grasses from moving rapidly. At this point the bellicose circonsilians would be ready, with their mortiferous clubs and their legendary contempt for danger. Right, strike and run, Boidi said. The truly insuperable barrier will be the fine circonsilians. And you, the poet urged, after the Huns have passed, must immediately reform your ranks and deploy in a semicircle at least half a mile long. So if the enemy falls back on that childish trick of theirs, pretending to retreat in order to encircle their pursuers, you will be the ones to squeeze them between your pincers, as they run right into your arms. Most important, not one of them must remain alive. A defeated enemy, if he survives, sooner or later will plot revenge. Then if some survivor manages to escape, you and the Nubians head towards the city. There the Penosians are ready to fly against him, and a surprise like that is something no enemy can withstand. The strategy had been so designed that nothing was left to chance, and at night the cohorts crowded into the center of the city and proceeded, by the light of the first stars, towards the plain, each preceded by its own priests and chanting in its own language the Pater Noster, with a majestic sonorous effect that had never been heard, not even in Rome in a most solemn procession. Mael neo, kui vi o les zal, aseno lazai tio mita. Vis lazai tio saleta, o fat obas, kel banal in sus, pisolidumos nemela. Como node monargan ola, pat isel, ka by ni silos. Nam alzi by sond. Qual alzi comi, o batteris notaris, ki du eso in saluma, factades sancatus, hanamananda deus, atfanade ha renanda deus. Amy pornio dan shin orneo vie, najor si lori, ifodir si bagalan, jor di domian. Hi koba ggia rile dad, ha bobby io estimda, ha salta io velka. Last to file by were the Blemier, as Buandulino and the poet were questioning each other about their delay. When they did arrive, each was bearing above his shoulders, bound beneath the armpits, an armature of reeds at the top of which a bird's head was placed. With pride, Ardzruni said that this was his latest invention. The Huns would see ahead, would aim at it, and the Blemier would be upon them, unharmed, in a matter of seconds. Buandulino said the idea was a good one, but they should hurry, because they had only a few hours to reach their position. The Blemier did not seem embarrassed at having acquired a head, indeed, they swaggered as if they were wearing a plumed helmet. Buandulino and the poet, with Ardzruni, climbed up the rise from which they were to direct the battle, and they awaited the dawn. They sent Gavagai with the front line, ready to keep them informed about what was happening. The brave Skiapod ran to his battle station, with the cry of, "Long live the most holy Magi, long live Pentapedzum." The mountains to the east were already glowing in the first solar rays when a wisp of smoke, fanned by the alert Ponces, warned that the Huns were about to appear on the horizon. And they did appear, in a long frontal line, so that from the distance it looked as if they were not advancing, but swaying or jerking, for a time that seemed very long to all. They realized the enemy was advancing only because, increasingly, the invaders were unable to see the hoofs of their horses, already concealed by the ferns from those who were watching at a distance, until the Huns were suddenly close to the hidden ranks of the first Skiapods, and all expected, in a moment, to see those brave Skiapods come out into the open. But time passed, the Huns advanced farther into the plain, and it was clear that something odd was happening down there. Whereas the Huns by now were quite visible, the Skiapods still showed no signs of life. It seemed that the giants, ahead of schedule, were rising, emerging, enormous, from the vegetation, but, instead of confronting the enemy, they threw themselves into the grass, engaged in a struggle with what ought to have been the Skiapods. Buandulino and the poet, from afar, couldn't really understand what was happening, but it was possible to reconstruct the stages of the battle, step by step, thanks to the courageous Gavagai, who sped like lightning from one end of the plain to the other. Through some atavistic instinct, when the sun rises, the Skiapod is led to lie down and to shield his head with his foot. And so the assault troops had done. The giants, even if they were not exactly quick-witted, had sensed that something was going wrong, and had started goading them. But following their heretical habit, they called them shit monsters, Aryan excrement. Skiapod good and loyal, Gavagai said in despair, as he reported the news, but won't take insults from cheese-eating heretics, you try to understand. In short, first a rapid theological and verbal scuffle broke out, then a hand-to-hand fight, and the giants quickly got the upper hand. Elaramo Scotchabarosi, known as Bonehead, had tried to detach his one-eyed fighters from that insane confrontation, but they had lost their minds and pushed him away with shoves that sent him flying 10 yards off. So they didn't realize that the Huns were by now on top of them, and what followed was a massacre. Skiapods fell and giants fell, even if some of the latter tried to defend themselves, grabbing a Skiapod by the foot and using him, in vain, as a bludgeon. Porcelli and Scotchabarosi flung themselves into the fray, each to inspire his own troops, but the Huns surrounded them. Our friends defended themselves, bravely wielding their swords, but they were soon pierced by 100 arrows. Now the Huns could be seen driving their way forward, crushing the grasses, amid the victims of their slaughter. Boidi and Kutika, at opposite sides of the plain, could not understand what was happening, and Gavagai had to be sent to them so they could accelerate the lateral intervention of the Blemier and the Pygmies. The Huns found themselves assaulted from opposite directions, but they had an inspired idea. Their vanguard advanced beyond the forces of the fallen Skiapods and giants, the rear guard withdrew, and so Pygmies on the one hand and Blemier on the other hurled themselves against each other. The Pygmies, seeing those fowls' heads appear from the weeds, unaware of Ardzruni's ruse, started shouting, "The cranes! The cranes!" and, believing they were confronting their age-old enemy, they forgot about the Huns and riddled the Blemier host with arrows. Now the Blemier were defending themselves against the Pygmies and, believing themselves betrayed, were shouting, "Death to the heretics!" The Pygmies, thinking the Blemier had turned traitor, and hearing themselves branded with heresy, whereas they considered themselves the sole custodians of the true faith, cried in turn, "Kill the ghosters!" The Huns fell on that brawl and dealt death blows, one by one, to their enemies, who were still striking one another. Gavagai now reported that he had seen Kutika trying to arrest the enemies single-handed. But then, overwhelmed, he had fallen under the hoofs of their horses. Boidi, at the sight of his dying friend, believed both forces lost, leapt on his horse and tried to ride beyond the Nubian barrier to alert them, but the ferns blocked him, as, for that matter, they also made difficulties for the advance of the enemies. With difficulty, Boidi reached the Nubians, took his position behind them and incited them to move, in one body, towards the Huns. But once he found them, thirsting for blood, in front of him, the doomed circumcellions followed their nature, or, rather, their natural propensity for martyrdom. They thought the moment of sublime sacrifice had arrived, and it was best to hasten it. One after another, they fell to their knees, imploring, "Kill me, kill me." The Huns could hardly believe their luck. They drew their short, finely honed swords and began slicing off heads of the circumcellions who crowded around them, stretching their necks and invoking the purifying bloodbath. Boidi, shaking his fist against the sky, turned and fled towards the hill, reaching it just before the plain burst into flames. In fact, Boran and Kayat, from the city, warned of the danger, thought to make use of the goats that Ardruni had prepared for that stratagem of his, futile in full daylight. They had the tongueless push hundreds of animals, their horns afire, into the plain. The sea of grass was being transformed into a sea of flames. Perhaps Boran and Kayat had thought the flames would confine themselves to drawing a fire barrier, or would drive back the enemy cavalry, but they hadn't considered the direction of the wind. The fire gained strength, but it was spreading towards the city. This development surely favored the Huns, who had only to wait until the grasses were burned, the ashes cool, and then they would have the path free for their final gallop. But, one way or another, it arrested their advance for an hour. The Huns, however, knew they had time. They confined themselves to taking positions at the edges of the fire and, raising their bows to the sky, they shot so many arrows that the sky was darkened, and the arrows fell beyond the barrier, since the Huns couldn't know if other enemies were awaiting them. One arrow fell, hissing from above, and struck the neck of Ardruni, who dropped to the ground with a stifled cough, blood issuing from his mouth. Trying to put his hands to his neck and extract the arrow, he saw them gradually covered with whitish patches. Buandulino and the poet bent over him and whispered to him that the same thing was happening to his face. "You see." Solomon was right, the poet said to him, "A remedy did exist. Perhaps the Huns' arrows are soaked in a poison that for you is an antidote, and dissolves the effect of those black stones." "What do I care if I die white or black?" Ardruni gasped, and he died, still of uncertain color. More arrows were now falling, thick and fast, and the hill had to be abandoned. They fled towards the city, with the stunned poet, who said, "It's all over. I gambled a kingdom and lost. We can't expect much from the endurance of the Benotians. Our only hope lies in the time the flames grant us. Let's collect our things and escape. To the west the path is still free." Buandulino, at that moment, had only one thought. The Huns would enter Pedianapedzum and would destroy it, but their mad dash would not stop there. They would press on, towards the lake, and invade the wood of the Hypatias. He had to reach it before them. But he couldn't abandon his friends, he had to find them. They all had to collect their belongings, some provisions, prepare for a long flight. "Gavagai, Gavagai," he shouted, and at once he saw his faithful friend at his side. "Run to the lake, find Hypatia. I don't know how you'll do it, but find her, tell her to be ready. I'll be coming to rescue her. I not know how to do, but I find her," the skiapod said and shot off. Buandulino and the poet entered the city. News of the defeat had already arrived. Females of every race, with their babes in arms, were running at random through the streets. The terrified Benotians, thinking that they now knew how to fly, were jumping into the void. But they had been taught to glide downward, not to hover in the sky, and they quickly found themselves on the ground. Those who desperately tried to flap their ears to move in the air, plummeted, exhausted, and were dashed against the rocks. They found Calandrino, desperate at the failure of his training, Solomon, Boran, and Kayat, who asked news of the others. "They are dead, peace to their spirits," the poet said angrily. "Hurry, to our quarters," Buandulino cried, and then to the west. When they reached their lodgings, they gathered up everything they could. Going down in great haste, opposite the tower they saw a bustle of eunuchs, loading their belongings on some mules. Praxias, livid, confronted the friends. "The deacon is dead, and you knew it," he said to Buandulino. "Dead or alive, you would flee all the same. We are leaving. When we reach the pass, we will set off an avalanche, and the path to the priest's kingdom will be closed forever. Do you want to come with us? If so, you must accept our terms." Buandulino didn't even ask him what those terms were. "What do I care about your damned Prester John?" he shouted. "I have more important things to think about. Come, friends." The others remained dumbfounded. Then Boran and Kayat admitted that their real aim was to find Zosimos again in the Grazel, and Zosimos surely had not yet reached the kingdom and would never arrive there now. Calandrino and Boidi said they had come with Buandulino and they would go with Buandulino. Solomon observed that his 10 tribes could be on either side of those mountains, so for him all directions were good. The poet didn't speak. He seemed to have lost all will, and another had to take the reins of his horse to lead him away. As they were about to flee, Buandulino saw one of the deacon's 2 acolytes coming towards him. The man was carrying a case. "It's the sheet with his features," he said. "He wanted you to have it. Put it to good use." Are you also fleeing? The veiled man said, here or there, if a there exists, for us it will be the same. The fate of our master awaits us. We will stay here and infect the Huns. Asterisk. Just outside the city, Buandulino saw a horrible sight. Towards the blue hills some flames were flickering. Somehow, since morning, over several hours, a part of the Huns had begun circling the scene of the battle, and they had already reached the lake. Quickly, Buandulino cried, in despair. Over there, all of you. Gallop. The others didn't understand. Why over there, when they're there already? Asked Boydie. This way, why not? Perhaps the only escape path remains to the south. Suit yourselves. I'm going, Buandulino shouted, beside himself. He's lost his mind, Calandrino said, imploring the others. We must follow him to make sure he does himself no harm. But by now Buandulino was far ahead of them, and, with Hypatia's name on his lips, he was heading for sure death. After half an hour's furious gallop, he stopped, glimpsing a swift form coming towards him. It was Gavagai. You be easy, Gavagai said to him. I seen her, now she's safe. This beautiful news was soon to be transformed into a source of desperation, because this is what Gavagai said. The Hypatias had been warned in time of the Huns' arrival, and, in fact, by the satyrs, who had come down from their hills and collected them, and when Gavagai arrived they were already leading the Hypatias away, up there, beyond the mountains, where only the satyrs knew how to move, and the Huns would never be able to reach them. Hypatia had waited till the last, as her companions tugged at her arms, hoping for news of Buandulino, and she was unwilling to leave before learning of his fate. Hearing Gavagai's message, she became calm and, smiling through her tears, said to tell him goodbye for her. Trembling, she charged Gavagai to tell Buandulino to flee, because his life was in danger. Sobbing, she gave him her last message. She loved him, and they would never see each other again. Buandulino asked Gavagai if he was crazy. He couldn't let Hypatia go into the mountains, he wanted to take her with him. But Gavagai said it was now too late, and before he could get there, where, for that matter, the Huns were now masters, as everywhere, the Hypatias would be beyond reach. Then, mastering his respect for one of the Magi, and putting a hand on his arm, he repeated Hypatia's last message. She would also wait for him, but her first duty was to protect their child. She said, I forever have with me someone who recalls to me Buandulino. Then, looking up at him, Gavagai asked, You made child with that female? None of your business, Buandulino said, ungratefully. Gavagai remained silent. Buandulino was still hesitating when his companions joined him. He realized that he could explain nothing to them, nothing they could understand. Then he tried to convince himself. It was all so rational. The wood was now conquered land. The Hypatias had fortunately gained the hills where their salvation lay. Hypatia had rightly sacrificed her love of Buandulino to love of that yet-to-be-born creature he had given her. It was all so heartbreakingly sensible, and there was no other possible choice. I had been warned, after all, Master Nikitas, that the demiurge had done things only halfway. 36. Buandulino and the rocks. Poor, unhappy Buandulino, said Nikitas, so moved that he forgot to savor the pig's head, boiled with salt, onions, and garlic, that Theophylactus had preserved throughout the winter in a little keg of seawater. Once again, every time you happened to conceive a passion for something true, fate punished you. After that evening we rode for 3 days and 3 nights, never stopping, never eating or drinking. I learned later that my friends performed miracles of cleverness to elude the Huns, who could be encountered anywhere within a range of many miles. I let them lead me. I followed them, and I thought of Hypatia. It's right, I told myself, that it has gone like this. Could I really have taken her with me? Would she have adapted to an unknown world, removed from the innocence of the wood, the familiar warmth of her rites, and the company of her sisters? Would she have renounced being one of the elect, called to redeem the divinity? I would have transformed her into a slave, a wretch. And further, I never asked her age, but perhaps she could have been my daughter twice over. When I abandoned Pindapedzum, I was, I believe, 50. To her I had appeared young and vigorous, because I was the first man she had seen, but in truth I was approaching old age. I could have given her little, while taking from her everything. I tried to convince myself that things had gone as they had to go. They had to go in a way that left me unhappy forever. If I accepted this, perhaps I would find my peace. You weren't tempted to turn back? Every moment, after those first 3 mindless days. But we had lost our way. The path we had taken wasn't the one by which we had arrived. We made infinite twists and turns, and crossed the same mountain 3 times, or perhaps they were 3 different mountains but we were no longer able to distinguish them. The sun alone wasn't enough to orient us, and with us we had neither Ardzruni nor his map. Perhaps we had circled the great mountain that occupies half of the tabernacle, and we were at the other end of the land. Then we were left without horses. The poor animals had been with us since the beginning of the journey and had aged with us. We hadn't been aware of this, because in Pindapedzum there were no other horses with which to compare them. Those last 3 days of precipitous flight exhausted them. Little by little they died, and for us it was almost a blessing, because they had the good sense to leave us, one after the other, in places where we found no food, and we ate their flesh, while little remained clinging to their bones. We continued on foot, and our feet were covered with sores. The only one who never complained was Gavagai, who had never needed horses, and who had on his foot a callus 2 inches thick. We literally ate locusts, and without honey, unlike the sainted fathers. Then we lost Calandrino, the youngest, the least experienced of us. He was looking for food among the rocks. He thrust his hand into a treacherous crevice and was bitten by a snake. He had just enough breath to tell me goodbye, whispering that I should remain faithful to the memory of his beloved sister, my most beloved wife, so that I would at least make her live in my memory. I had forgotten Calandrina, and once again I felt an adulterer and a traitor, both to Calandrina and to Calandrino. And then all goes dark. Master Nikitas, I left Pandapedzum, according to my calculations, in the summer of the year of our Lord 1197. I arrived here at Constantinople last January. Between those dates there were then 6.5 years of emptiness, an emptiness in my spirit and perhaps in the world. 6 years wandering in deserts? 1 year, or 2. Who could keep track of time? After the death of Calandrino, months later perhaps, we found ourselves at the foot of some mountains we didn't know how to scale. Of the 12 who had set out, 6 of us remained, 6 men and a skiapod. Our clothes in tatters, our bodies wasted, burned by the sun, we had nothing left but our weapons and our knapsacks. We said to ourselves that perhaps we had reached the end of our journey, and it was our fate to die there. Suddenly we saw coming towards us a squad of men on horseback. They were sumptuously dressed, bearing shining arms, with human bodies and dogs' heads. They were cynocephala, so they do exist, by God's truth. They questioned us, barking. We didn't understand. The one who seemed their leader smiled. It may have been a smile, or a snarl, that bared his sharpened teeth. He gave an order to the others, and they bound us, in single file. They made us cross the mountain along a path that they knew. Then, after some hours' march, we descended into a valley surrounded on all sides by another mountain, very high, with a powerful fortress circled by birds of prey that, even from a distance, seemed enormous. I remembered Abdul's old description, and I recognized the fortress of Alodin. So it was. The cynocephala made them climb tortuous steps dug into the stone up to that impregnable refuge, then brought them into the castle, where, amid towers and keeps, they could glimpse hanging gardens, and catwalks barred by sturdy gratings. They were handed over to other cynocephala, armed with scourges. Moving along a corridor, Buandulino caught sight, through a window, of a kind of courtyard amid very high walls, where many young men were languishing in chains, and he remembered how Alodin trained his henchmen to crime, bewitching them with the green honey. Led into a sumptuous hall, they saw an old man, who seemed a centenarian, seated on embroidered cushions. He had a white beard, black eyebrows, and a grim gaze. Alive and powerful when he had captured Abdul, almost half a century earlier, Alodin was still there controlling his slaves. He looked at the newcomers with contempt, obviously realizing that these wretches were not good enough for enrollment among his young assassins. He didn't even speak to them. He made a bored gesture to one of his servants, as if to say, "Do as you please with them." His curiosity was aroused only by the sight of the skiapod behind them. He motioned him to move, gestured to him to raise his foot above his head, and laughed. The 6 men were taken away, and Gavagai was left with him. Thus began the long imprisonment of Buandulino, Boron, Kayat, Rabbi Solomon, Boidi, and the poet, their feet always bound by a chain, which ended in a stone ball. They were employed in servile tasks, sometimes washing the tiles of the floors and walls, sometimes turning the wheels of the mills, sometimes bidden to carry quarters of ram to the rocks. They were flying beasts, Buandulino explained to Nikitas, as big as 10 eagles put together, with a hooked, sharp beak that in a few instants could strip away the flesh of an ox. Their claws had talons that seemed the prow of a warship. They moved restlessly in a huge cage set on a turret, ready to attack anyone, except one eunuch, who seemed to speak their language and who kept them in order, moving among them as if he were among the chickens in his coop. He was also the only one who could send them out as Alodin's messengers. He would place on one of them, at the neck and along the back, some sturdy thongs that he ran beneath their wings. To the thongs he attached a basket, or another weight. Then he opened a shutter, issued a command to the bird thus equipped, and only that one could fly out of the tower and vanish in the sky. We saw them also return. The eunuch led them in, and detached from their harness a bag or a metal cylinder that apparently contained a message for the lord of the place. At other times the prisoners spent days and days in idleness, because there was nothing to do. Sometimes they were assigned to serve the eunuch who carried the green honey to the young men in chains, and with horror they saw those faces, devastated by the dream that consumed them. If not the dream, then a subtle listlessness devoured the prisoners, who whiled away the time constantly telling one another the vicissitudes they had shared. They recalled Paris, Alessandria, the lively markets, the serene stay among the gymnosophists. They talked about the priest's letter, and the poet, more gloomy every day, seemed to repeat the deacon's words as if he had heard them. The suspicion that consumes me is that the kingdom does not exist. Who spoke of it to us, in Pandapedzum? The eunuchs. To whom did the messengers, sent to the priest, return? To them, to the eunuchs. Had those messengers really gone out? Did they really return? The deacon had never seen his father. Everything we learned from the eunuchs. Maybe it was all a plot of the eunuchs, who were mocking the deacon, and us, and white Huns existed. Buandulino told him to remember their companions who had died in battle, but the poet shook his head. Rather than remind himself that he had been defeated, he preferred to believe he had been the victim of a spell. Then they went back to the death of Frederick, and each time they invented a new explanation to make that inexplicable death comprehensible. It had been Zosimos, that was clear. No, Zosimos had stolen the Grazel, but only afterwards. Someone, hoping to gain possession of the Grazel, had acted beforehand. Ardruni? Who could know? One of their slain companions? What a ghastly thought. One of the survivors? But in such misfortune, Buandulino said, must we also suffer the torment of reciprocal suspicion? As long as we were traveling, excited by the search for the kingdom of the priest, we were not seized by these doubts. Each helped the other in the spirit of friendship. It was captivity that made us snarl. We couldn't look one another in the face, and for years we hated one another in turn. I lived withdrawn into myself. I thought of Hypatia, but I was unable to remember her face. I remembered only the joy she gave me. At night my restless hand might stray to the hair of my sex, and I dreamed of touching her fleece that wafted the scent of moss. I could arouse myself because, if our spirit was delirious, our body was gradually recovering from the effects of our peregrinations. Up there they did not feed us badly, we received abundant food twice a day. Perhaps this was the way that Elodin, who never admitted us to the secrets of his green honey, kept us calm. In fact, we had regained strength but, despite the hard tasks we were forced to perform, we were growing fat. I looked at my prominent belly and said to myself, "You're beautiful, Buandulino. Are all men beautiful like you?" Then I would laugh like an idiot. The only moments of consolation were when Gavagai visited them. Their excellent friend had become Elodin's jester, amusing him with his unpredictable movements, performing little services for him, flying through rooms and corridors to carry out his orders. He had learned the Saracen language, he enjoyed great liberty. He brought his friends some delicacies from the Lord's kitchen, kept them informed about the events of the fortress, or the dogged struggles among the eunuchs to gain the favor of the master, or the murderous missions on which the young dreamers were dispatched. One day he gave Buandulino some green honey, but just a little, he said, otherwise he would be reduced to the state of those bestial assassins. Buandulino took it, and enjoyed a night of love with Hypatia. But towards the end of the dream her features changed. She had agile legs, white and comely as those of the females of men, and a goat's head. Gavagai informed them that their weapons and their knapsacks had been thrown into a closet, and he would be able to find them again if they were to attempt an escape. "Really, Gavagai, do you think we can escape one day?" Buandulino asked him. "I believes yes. I believes many good ways to escape. I only have to find best. But you become fat like eunuch, and if you fat, you run bad. You have to move body, like me. You put foot over head and you become light." Foot over head, no. But Buandulino realized that the hope, even vain, of an escape would help him bear imprisonment without going mad, and so he prepared himself for the event, moving his arms, bending his knees dozens and dozens of times until he fell, exhausted, on his rotund belly. He urged his friends to do the same, and with the poet he pretended to wrestle. Sometimes they would spend an entire afternoon trying to throw each other to the floor. With the chain at their feet it wasn't easy, and they had lost the agility of bygone days. Not only because of prison. It was age, but it did them good. The only one who had totally forgotten his body was Rabbi Solomon. He ate very little, so he was too weak for the various tasks, and his friends did his share. He had no scroll to read, no implement for writing. He spent hours repeating the name of the Lord, and every time it had a different sound. He had lost his remaining teeth, now he had only gums, left and right. He chomped his food and spoke with a hiss. He was convinced that the 10 lost tribes could not have remained in a kingdom half made up of Nestorians, who could be tolerated, because like the Jews they believed that Mary, good woman though she was, could not have generated any god. But the other half were idolaters, who increased or diminished the number of divinities at will. "No," he said, disconsolate, "perhaps the 10 tribes passed through the kingdom, but then resumed their wandering. We Jews are always seeking a promised land, provided it be elsewhere, and now who knows where they are, perhaps only a few steps from this place where I am ending my days, but I've given up all hope of finding them. Let us bear the trials that the Holy One, always blessed be his name, sends us." Job saw worse. He had lost his mind. You could see that. And Kayat and Boron also seemed mad to me, always disputing. Pondering the Grazel that they would find again, indeed, now they thought it would cause itself to be found by them. The more they talked of it, the more its virtues, already miraculous, became super miraculous, and the more they dreamed of possessing it. The poet kept repeating, "Just let me get my hands on Zosimos, and I'll become master of the world." "Forget Zosimos," I said, "he didn't even reach Pentapedzum. Maybe he was lost along the way. His skeleton is turning to dust in some dusty place, and his Grazel has been taken by nomad infidels who maybe use it to piss in." "Be silent," Boron said to me, blanching. "How were you able to free yourselves from that inferno?" Nikitas asked. One day Gavagai came and told us he had found the way to escape. Poor Gavagai, he too had aged. I have never known the lifespan of a skiapod, but he no longer preceded himself like a lightning bolt. He arrived like thunder, a little late, and at the end of his run he was panting. This was the plan. Armed, we had to surprise the eunuch guarding the rocks, force him to fit them out as usual, but in such a way that the thongs, instead of being fastened to their packs, were tied to the belts of the fugitives. Then he was to give the birds the order to fly to Constantinople. Gavagai had spoken with the eunuch, and had learned that he often sent the rocks to that city, to an agent there who lived on a hill near Pera. Both Buandulino and Gavagai understood Saracen and could verify that the eunuch was giving the right command. Once they reached their destination, the birds would land on their own. Why not think of this before? Gavagai asked himself, comically striking his head with his fists. Fine, Buandulino said, but how can we fly with a chain on our leg? I find file, Gavagai said. At night Gavagai had found their weapons in packs, and had brought them to their sleeping quarters. Swords and daggers were rusted, but the friends spent nights cleaning them and sharpening them, rubbing them against the stones of the walls. They had the file. It wasn't anything special, and they had to spend weeks cutting into the rings that circled their ankles. They succeeded. Beneath the cracked rings they passed a cord, bound to the chain, and as they shambled around the castle, they appeared shackled as always. A close look would have revealed the deceit, but they had been there so many years that nobody paid any attention, and the cynocephala by now considered them domestic animals. One evening they learned that the next day they would have to remove some sacks of spoiled meat from the kitchen and take them to the birds. Gavagai alerted them. This was the opportunity they had been awaiting. Next morning they went to collect the sacks. Acting as if they were doing this reluctantly, they passed through their quarters, slipped their weapons amid the meat. They arrived at the cages, where Gavagai was already present, amusing the eunuch keeper with his somersaults. The rest was easy. They opened the sacks, slipped out their daggers, put all 6 of them to the keeper's throat. Solomon looked at them as if what they were doing mattered nothing to him, and Buandulino explained to the eunuch what he was to do. It seemed there weren't enough harnesses, but the poet hinted at cutting off the ears of the eunuch. He had already had more than enough cut off, and he declared himself ready to cooperate. 7 birds were prepared to bear the weight of 7 men, or rather, 6 men in a skiapod. I want the strongest one, the poet said, because you, and he turned to the eunuch, unfortunately can't stay here or else you'll give the alarm, or shout at your beasts to come back. Another rope will be tied to my belt, and you'll dangle from that. So my bird must bear the weight of 2 people. Buandulino translated. The eunuch declared himself happy to accompany his captors to the end of the world, but he asked what would then become of him. They assured him that once in Constantinople, he could go on his way. And hurry up, the poet ordered, because the stink of this cage is unbearable. But it took almost an hour to arrange everything properly. Each hung himself carefully from his own raptor, and to his belt the poet fastened the strap that would bear the eunuch. The only one still not bound was Gavagai, who was watching from the corner of the corridor, making sure no one came to spoil things. Someone did come. After a long time the guards were surprised to note that the prisoners, sent to feed the birds, had not returned. A group of cynocephala arrived at the end of the corridor, barking with concern. Dogheads coming. Gavagai cried. You leave right away. Right away my foot, Buandulino cried. Come, we'll have time to strap you up. It wasn't true, and Gavagai knew it. If he fled, the cynocephala would reach the cage before the eunuch could open the shutter and make the birds fly. He shouted to the others to open the cage and leave. In the sacks of meat he had also slipped his fistula. He seized it, along with the 3 remaining darts. Skiapod die, but always true to most holy magi, he said. He lay on the floor, raised his foot over his head, which he lowered as he put the fistula to his mouth, blew, and the leading cynocephalos fell dead. While the others were drawing back, Gavagai had time to fell 2 more of them, then he was left without darts. To restrain the attackers, he held the fistula as if he were still about to blow into it, but the deceit was short-lived. The monsters were upon him and ran him through with their swords. Meanwhile the poet had stuck his dagger a short distance into the chin of the eunuch, who, shedding his first blood, had realized what was being asked of him and, though made clumsy by his trappings, he managed to open the shutter. When he saw Gavagai die, the poet shouted, It's finished. Away, away. The eunuch gave a command to the rocks, who flung themselves into the air and rose in flight. The cynocephala were entering the cage at that moment, but their rush was arrested by the remaining birds, enraged by the confusion, who began pecking at the newcomers. All 6 were in full flight. Did he give the command for Constantinople? The poet asked Buandulino in a loud voice, and Buandulino nodded yes. Then we don't need him anymore, the poet said. With one slash of his dagger he severed the strap that bound the eunuch to him, and the eunuch plunged into the void. Now we'll fly better, the poet said. Gavagai is avenged. And so we flew, Master Nikitas, high above desolate plains marked only by the wounds of rivers dried up since time immemorial, cultivated fields, lakes, forests. We clung to the feet of the birds, because we feared the harnesses wouldn't support us. We flew for a time I cannot calculate, and the palms of our hands were bleeding. We saw flowing beneath us expanses of sand, lush fertile lands, meadows, and mountain peaks. We flew under the sun, but in the shadow of those long wings that beat the air above our heads. I don't know how long we flew, even at night, and at an altitude surely denied even to the angels. At a certain point, below us we saw, in a deserted plain, 10 hosts. So it seemed to us, of people, or were they ants, proceeding almost parallel towards God knows where. Rabbi Solomon began shouting that they were the 10 lost tribes and he wanted to join them. He tried to make his bird descend, pulling on its feet, trying to direct its flight as with the ropes of a sail or the bar of a rudder, but the bird became enraged, freed itself from his grasp and tried to claw his head. Solomon, don't be an asshole, Boydie shouted at him. They're not your people, they's just ordinary nomads going they don't know where. Wasted breath, seized by a mystical madness. Solomon grew so agitated that he freed himself from his harness and fell, or rather, flew, arms wide, through the heavens like an angel of the Almighty, may his name always be blessed, but an angel attracted by a promised land. We saw him grow smaller until his form was confused with those of the ants down below. After more time had passed, the rocks, faithful to the order received, arrived within sight of Constantinople, its domes glowing in the sun. They landed where they were supposed to land, and our friends freed themselves from their bonds. One man, however, perhaps the sycophant of Elodon, came towards them, amazed by this descent of too many messengers. The poet smiled at him, gripped his sword, and gave a flat blow to the head. Benedico te in nomine Elodini, he said seraphically, while the man fell down like a sack. Whoosh, whoosh, he then cried at the birds. They seemed to understand the tone of his voice, rose in flight, and disappeared on the horizon. We're home, Boidi said happily, though he was 1,000 miles from his home. Let's hope our Genoese friends are still somewhere around, Buandulino said. We'll hunt for them. You'll see, our Baptists' heads will still come in handy, the poet said, who seemed suddenly rejuvenated. We're back among Christians. We've lost Pentapedzum, but we can conquer Constantinople. He didn't know, Nikitas commented with a sad smile, that other Christians were already doing just that. 37. Buandulino enriches the treasures of Byzantium. As soon as we tried to cross the Golden Horn and enter the city, we realized that we were in the strangest situation we had ever seen. It wasn't a besieged city, because the enemies, though their ships were lying offshore, were encamped at Pera, and many of them were strolling around the city. It wasn't a conquered city, because along with the invaders wearing the cross on their chests, soldiers of the emperor were seen in the city. In short, the Crusaders were in Constantinople, but Constantinople wasn't theirs. And when we found my Genoese friends, who were the same ones you later lived with, not even they could explain clearly what had happened or what was about to happen. It was hard to understand also for us, Nikitas said with a sigh of resignation. And yet one day I will have to write the history of that period. After the sorry outcome of the expedition for the reconquest of Jerusalem attempted by your Frederick and the kings of France and England, more than 10 years later the Latins had chosen to try again, under the leadership of great princes like Baudouin of Flanders and Boniface of Monferrato. But they needed a fleet, and they had one built by the Venetians. I've heard you speak scornfully of the greed of the Genoese, but, compared to the Venetians, the people of Genoa are generosity personified. The Latins got their ships, but they didn't have the money to pay for them, and Dandolo, the Venetian doge, fate had decreed that he should also be blind, but among all the blind men in this story he was the only farsighted one, asked that, in payment of their debt, before going to the Holy Land, they helped subdue Zara. The pilgrims agreed, and that was the first crime, because you don't put on the cross to then go and conquer a city for the Venetians. Meanwhile, Alexius, brother of that Isaac Angelus who had deposed Andronicus to take over power, had had him blinded, exiled him to the coast, and proclaimed himself basileus. That much the Genoese told me at once. It was a confused story, because Isaac's brother had become Alexius III, but there was also an Alexius, son of Isaac, who had managed to flee, reaching Zara, now in Venetian hands, where he asked the Latin pilgrims to help him regain the throne of his father, promising, in return, assistance in the conquest of the Holy Land. It's easy to promise what you don't yet have. Alexius III, for that matter, should have realized that his empire was at risk. But, even if he still had his eyes, he was blinded by ignorance and by the corruption surrounding him. Imagine. At a certain point he wanted to have more warships built, but the guardians of the imperial forests would not allow trees to be cut down. On the other hand, Michael Ziplinus, general of the army, had already sold off sails and rigging, rudders and other parts of the existing ships, to fill his coffers. Meanwhile, as Zara the young Alexius was hailed as emperor by those peoples, and in June of the previous year, the Latins arrived opposite the city. 110 galleys and 70 ships transporting 1,000 men at arms and 3,000 foot soldiers, with shields on the vessel's flanks and banners in the wind and standards on the fusiles, paraded through the Strait of St. George, with trumpets blaring and drums rolling, and our men were on the walls to watch the spectacle. Only a few hurled stones, but more to make noise than to do harm. Only when the Latins tied up directly opposite Pera did that madman Alexius III send out the imperial army. But it, too, was only a parade. In Constantinople we lived in a kind of somnolence. Perhaps you know that the entrance to the Horn was defended by a great chain that joined one bank to the other, but our forces defended it poorly. The Latins broke the chain, entered the port, and disembarked the entire army before the imperial palace of the Blacherne. Our army came out from the walls, led by the emperor. From the ramparts the ladies watched the show and said that our men seemed angels, with their beautiful armor gleaming in the sun. They realized something was going wrong only when the emperor, instead of engaging in battle, went back into the city. They understood it even better a few days later, when the Venetians attacked the walls from the sea and some Latins managed to scale them and set fire to the nearest houses. My fellow citizens began to understand after this first fire. What did Alexius III do then? During the night he loaded 10,000 gold pieces on a ship and abandoned the city. And Isaac returned to the throne. Yes, but by now he was old and also blind, and the Latins reminded him he was to share the empire with his son, who had become Alexius IV. With this boy the Latins had established some pacts of which we were still ignorant. The Empire of Byzantium returned to Catholic and Roman dominion. The Basilisk gave the pilgrims 100,000 silver marks, provisions for a year, 10,000 horsemen to march on Jerusalem, and a garrison of 500 knights in the Holy Land. Isaac realized that there wasn't enough money in the imperial treasury, and he couldn't go and tell the clergy and the people that suddenly he was placing himself under the Pope of Rome. Thus a farce began that lasted for months. On the one hand, Isaac and his son, to collect money, sacked the churches, their men, with axes, cut out the images of Christ, and after stripping them of their ornaments, threw them in the fire, and melted down anything they found made of gold or silver. On the other hand, the Latins, ensconced at Pera, ran freely on this side of the Horn, sat at Isaac's table, lorded it over the whole city, and did everything to delay their departure. They said they were waiting to be paid down to the last penny, and the man who was most insistent was Doge Dandolo for his Venetians, but truly I believe that here they had found paradise, and they were blissfully living at our expense. Not content with taxing the Christians, and perhaps to justify their delay in engaging the Saracens of Jerusalem, some of them went to loot the houses of the Saracens who were peacefully living here in Constantinople, and in this conflict they set the second fire, in which I also lost the most beautiful of my houses. And the two emperors didn't protest to their allies? At this point they were both hostages in the hands of the Latins, who had made Alexius IV their puppet. Once, when he was in their camp, amusing himself like any ordinary man at arms, they took the golden hat from his head and put it on their own heads. Never had a basileus of Byzantium been so humiliated. As for Isaac, he was turning into an idiot. Among gluttonous monks, he raved that he would become emperor of the world and would regain his sight. Until the populace rose up, and elected Nicholas Canabos basileus. A good man, but by then the strong man had become Alexius Doukas Murzuphilus, supported by the leaders of the army. So it was easy for him to seize power. Isaac died of a heart attack, Murzuphilus had Canabos beheaded and Alexius IV strangled, so he became Alexius V. Yes, we arrived just in those days when nobody knew any longer who was in command, whether it was Isaac, Canabos, Murzuphilus, or the pilgrims, and we couldn't tell, when someone spoke of Alexius, whether he meant the third, the fourth, or the fifth. We found the Genoese still living where you also found them, while the houses of the Venetians and the Pisans had been burned in the second fire, and they had withdrawn to Pera. In this unfortunate city, the poet decided that we had to rebuild our fortunes. Asterisk. When anarchy rules, the poet said, anyone can make himself king. Meanwhile, we had to find some money. The 5 survivors were tattered, filthy, without resources. The Genoese welcomed them with good heart, but said that a guest is like fish and stinks after 3 days. The poet washed himself carefully, trimmed his hair and beard, borrowed some decent clothes from our hosts, and one fine morning went out to collect news in the city. He came back at evening and said, starting today Murzuphilus is basileus, he's done away with all the others. Apparently, to make himself look good to his subjects, he wants to provoke the Latins, and they consider him a usurper, because they had made their agreements with poor Alexius IV, rest in peace, young as he was, but obviously he was doomed to end badly. The Latins are waiting for Murzuphilus to make a misstep. For the present they continue getting drunk in the taverns, but they are well aware that sooner or later they will kick him out and put the city to the sack. They already know which gold objects are found in which churches, they also know that the city is full of hidden relics. However, they know that relics are not toys, and their leaders will want to seize them for themselves and take them home to their cities. But since these Greeklings are no better than they are, the pilgrims are wooing this one and that, to secure for themselves now, and on the cheap, the most important relics. Moral of the tale. The man who wants to make his fortune in this city sells relics. One who wants to make his fortune when he's back home, buys them. Then the moment has come for us to bring out our Baptists' heads. Boydie said, hopefully. Boydie, you're just talking because you have a mouth, the poet said. First of all, in a single city, you could sell 1 head at most, because then the news spreads. In the second place, I've heard there's already 1 Baptist's head in Constantinople, and maybe even 2. Suppose we'd already sold both, and we turn up with a third, they'll cut our throats. So, as to Baptists' heads, nothing doing. But looking for relics takes time. The problem isn't finding them, it's making them, identical to those that exist, though no one has yet discovered them. As I was moving around I heard some talk of Christ's purple cloak, the reed and the pillar of the flagellation. The sponge soaked in gall and wormwood that was offered to our Lord as he died, only now it's dry, and the crown of thorns. A case which once contained a piece of the bread consecrated at the Last Supper, some hairs from the Lord's beard, the seamless garment of Jesus that the soldiers diced for, the mantle of the Madonna. We have to imagine which are the easiest to counterfeit, Buandulino said, pensive. Exactly, the poet said. You can find a reed anywhere, a pillar is best forgotten because you can't sell it quietly. But why risk copies when somebody might find the real relic, and our buyers of the fakes would want their money back? Boron said sensibly, think how many relics could exist. Think for example of the 12 baskets from the multiplication of the loaves and fishes. Bread baskets can be found anywhere. You just have to dirty them a bit, to make them look old. Think of the axe with which Noah built the ark. There must be an axe around here that our Genoese have thrown away because the blade is chipped. Not a bad idea, Boydie said. Go to the cemeteries and you'll find the jawbone of St. Peter and the left arm, not the head, of St. John the Baptist, to say nothing of the remains of Saint Agatha, of Lazarus, or the prophets Daniel, Samuel, Isaiah, the skull of Saint Helen, a fragment of the head of Saint Philip Apostle. If it comes to that, Pevera said, attracted by the wonderful prospect, we only have to rummage around a bit in the cellar, and I'll easily find you a fragment of the Bethlehem manger, very tiny, so there's no telling where it really came from. We'll make relics whose like they've never seen before, the poet said, but we'll remake the ones that already exist, because they're the ones everybody's talking about, and the price goes up every day. Asterisk. For a week the house of the Genoese was transformed into a humming workshop. Boidi, stumbling in the sawdust, found a nail from the Holy Cross. Boiamondo, after a night of horrible pains, tied some string to a rotten tooth, pulled it out easily, and there was a tooth of St. Anne. Grillo dried bread in the sun and put some crumbs into certain boxes of aged wood that Terebrillo had just fashioned. Pevera had convinced them to give up the notion of the loaves and fishes baskets because, he said, after a miracle like that the crowd would have surely divided them up, and not even Constantine would have been able to put them back together. Selling just one, they wouldn't make a great impression, and it was in any case difficult to pass them, secretly, from hand to hand, because Jesus had fed so very many people, and he can't have used a little basket you could hide under a cloak. Well, so much for the baskets, the poet said, but you've got to find me. Noah's axe. Of course, Pevera replied, and one appeared, its blade now resembling a saw, the handle all charred. After which our friends dressed up like Armenian merchants, the Genoese by now were prepared to finance the venture, and began roaming slyly among taverns and Christian camps, dropping a hint, referring to the difficulties of the matter, raising prices because they were risking their life, and things like that. Boidi came back one evening saying that he had found a Monferrato knight who would take Noah's axe, but he wanted a guarantee that it was the real thing. Oh, of course, Buandulino said, we'll go to Noah and ask him for a certificate with his seal. And did Noah know how to write? Boron asked. Noah knew only how to down bottle after bottle of the best, Boidi said. He must have already been drunk as a skunk when he loaded the animals onto the ark. He overdid it with the mosquitoes but forgot the unicorns. That's why you don't see any more of them. Oh, you can see them still, Buandulino murmured, suddenly losing his good humor. Pevera said that in his travels he had learned a bit of the Jews' writing, and with a knife he could carve one or two of their curlicues on the handle of the axe. Was Noah a Jew, or not? He was a Jew, yes, a Jew, the friends confirmed. Poor Solomon, it's just as well he's no longer here. Otherwise God knows how he would suffer. But Boidi then managed to sell the axe. On certain days it was hard to find buyers, because the city was in an uproar, and the pilgrims were suddenly recalled to their camp, in a state of alert. For example, there was a rumor that Murzuphilus had attacked Philia, down the coast, the pilgrims had intervened in compact formations, there had been a battle, or perhaps a skirmish, but Murzuphilus had taken a good beating and they conquered his standard with the Virgin, which his army carried as its banner. Murzuphilus returned to Constantinople, but told his men not to confess this shame to anyone. The Latins discovered his reticence, and then one morning they sailed a galley of theirs right in front of the walls, with the banner in full view, as they made obscene gestures to the Rami, such as jabbing fingers or clapping their left hand on their right arm. Murzuphilus cut a sorry figure, and the Rami sang rude songs about him in the streets. In short, between the time it took to make a good relic and the time it took to find the right gull, our friends had gone from January to March, but, what with the chin of St. Eobanus today and the tibia of St. Cunegonde tomorrow, they had put together a goodly sum, refunding the Genoese and refurbishing themselves properly. And this, Master Nikitas, explains the presence, over these past days, of so many duplicate relics in your city, until only God himself knows which are genuine. On the other hand, put yourself in our shoes. Somehow we had to survive, between the Latins, always ready to steal, and your Greculi, excuse me, your Romans, ready to defraud them. Basically, we defrauded the defrauders. Ah well, said Nikitas, resigned, perhaps many of these relics will inspire holy thoughts in barbarianized Latins, who will find them again in their barbarian churches. Holy the thought, holy the relic. The ways of the Lord are infinite. At this point they could be calm and could set out again for their homelands. Kayat and Boron by now had renounced the recovery of the Grazel and of Zosimos with it. Boidi said that, with this money, in Alessandria he would buy some vineyards and end his days like a gentleman. Buandulino had fewer ideas than any of them. Now that the search for Prester John had ended, and Hypatia was lost, living or dying mattered little to him. But not the poet. He had been seized by fantasies of omnipotence, he was distributing the things of the Lord through the world universe, he could start offering something not to miserable pilgrims, but to the mighty who led them, gaining their favor. One day he came to report that in Constantinople was the Mandilion, the face of Edessa, an inestimable relic. What's this mandolin? Boiamondo asked. It's a little cloth to wipe your face with, the poet explained, and it has the face of our Lord impressed on it. Not painted, impressed, by virtue of nature. It's an image, acheiropoietin, not made by the hand of man. Abgar V, king of Edessa, was a leper, and he sent his archivist Hanan to invite Jesus to come and cure him. Jesus couldn't go, so he took this cloth, wiped his face, and left his features imprinted on it. Naturally, on receiving the cloth, the king was cured and was converted to the true faith. Centuries ago, while the Persians were besieging Edessa, the Mandilion was flown over the walls of the city, and it was saved. Then the Emperor Constantine acquired the cloth and brought it here, where it was first in the church of the Blachernay, then in St. Sophia, then in the chapel of the Pharos. And this is the true Mandalion, even if they say others exist. At Camulia in Cappadocia, at Memphis in Egypt, and at Anablatha near Jerusalem. Which is not impossible, because Jesus, in his life, may have wiped his face several times. But this one is surely the most wondrous of all, because on Easter Day the face changes according to the hour. At dawn it takes on the features of the newborn Jesus, at the 3rd hour those of Jesus a boy, and so on, until at the 9th hour it appears as Jesus adult at the moment of the Passion. Where did you learn all these things? Boydie asked. A monk told me. Now this is a genuine relic, and with an object like this we can return to our homes and receive honors and prebends. We have only to find the right bishop, as Buandulino did with Reynald for his 3 magi. Up till now we've sold relics, now's the moment to buy one, the relic that will make our fortune. And who are you going to buy the Mandalion from? Buandulino asked wearily, nauseated by now at all this simony. It's already been bought by a Syrian I spent an evening drinking with. He works for the Duke of Athens. But he told me that this duke would give the Mandalion and God knows what else besides, if he could acquire the Sidwan. Now you'll tell us what the Sidwan is, Boydie said. They say it might have been in St. Mary's in the Blachernay, the Holy Shroud, the one with the image of the whole body of Jesus. They talk about it in the city. They say it was seen by Amalric, the king of Jerusalem, when he visited Manuel Comnenius. But others told me that it had been left in the keeping of the Church of the Blessed Virgin at the Bucolion. But nobody has ever seen it, and if it was there, it disappeared, nobody knows how long ago. I can't see what you're getting at, Buandulino said. Somebody has the Mandalion, yes. And this somebody would trade it for the Sidwan, but you don't have the Sidwan, and I would be revolted if we fabricated here an image of our Lord. So? I don't have the Sidwan, the poet said. But you do. Me? Remember when I asked you what was in that case that the deacon's acolytes gave you before we fled from Pentapedzum? You told me it was the image of that poor man, imprinted on his winding sheet, just after he died. Show it to me. You're crazy. It's a sacred charge. The deacon entrusted me with it so I could give it to Prester John. Buandulino, you're past 60, and you still believe in Prester John? We've had living proof that he doesn't exist. Let me see the thing. Reluctantly Buandulino took the case from his sack, removed a roll, and, unfolding it, revealed a cloth of large dimensions, motioning to the others to push aside tables and stools because it required much space to spread it out on the floor. It was an actual sheet, very large, which bore a double impression of the human form, front and back. A face could distinctly be seen, the hair falling to the shoulders, mustache and beard, closed eyes. Touched by the grace of death, the unhappy deacon had left on the cloth an image of serene features and a powerful body, on which one could see only with difficulty the uncertain signs of wounds, bruises or sores, the traces of the leprosy that had destroyed him. Buandulino stood there, moved, and recognized that, on that linen, the dead man had regained the stigmata of his mournful majesty. Then he murmured, "We can't sell the image of a leper, and what's more Nestorian, as that of our Lord." "First of all, the Duke of Athens doesn't know," the poet replied, "and we have to sell it to him, not to you. Second, we're not selling it, we're trading it, so it's not simony. I'm going to find the Syrian. The Syrian will ask you why you're making the trade, seeing that a Sidwan is infinitely more precious than a Mandalion," Buandulino said. "Because it's harder to carry out of Constantinople in secret. Because it's too valuable, and only a king could allow himself to buy it, whereas for the face we can find purchasers of less importance, but ready to pay on the spot. Because if we offered the Sidwan to a Christian prince he would say that we stole it here, and he'd have us hanged, whereas the face of Edessa could be the face of Camulia or of Memphis or of Anablatha. The Syrian will understand my reasoning, because we belong to the same race." "All right," Buandulino said, "you pass this cloth on to the Duke of Athens, and I don't give a damn if he takes home an image that isn't of Christ. But you know that this image for me is far more precious than the one of Christ, you know what memories it has for me, and you can't make an illicit trade of something so venerated." "Buandulino," the poet said, "we don't know what we'll find back there when we go home. With the face of Edessa we'll get an archbishop on our side, and our fortune is made again. And anyway, Buandulino, if you hadn't carried this shroud away from Pentapedzum, by now the Huns would be wiping their ass with it. This man was dear to you. You told me his story while we were wandering through the deserts and while we were prisoners, and you mourned his death, so futile and forgotten. Well, his last portrait will be venerated somewhere like that of Christ. What more sublime sepulchre could you wish for a dead man you loved? We are not humiliating the memory of his body, but rather, how can I say it, Boron? We're transfiguring it, yes. Perhaps it was because in the chaos of those days I had lost the sense of what's right and what's wrong, perhaps I was just tired, Master Nikitas." I consented. The poet went off to trade the Sidwan, ours, or rather, mine, or rather, the deacon's, for the Mandalion. Buandulino started laughing, and Nikitas couldn't understand why. The trick. We learned of it that evening. The poet went to the tavern he knew, made his infamous bargain, to get the Syrian drunk he got drunk himself, he came out, was followed by someone who was aware of his dealings, perhaps the Syrian himself, who, as the poet said, was of his same race. He was attacked in an alley, beaten half to death, and he came home, more drunk than Noah, bleeding, bruised, without Sidwan and without Mandalion. I wanted to kick the life out of him, but he was a finished man. For the second time he had lost a kingdom. In the days that followed we had to force him to eat. I told myself I was glad that I had never had too many ambitions, if the defeat of one ambition could reduce a man to that state. Then I admitted that I, too, was the victim of many frustrated ambitions. I had lost my beloved father, I had not found for him the kingdom, I had lost forever the woman I loved. In short, I had learned that the demiurge had done things halfway, whereas the poet still believed that in this world some victory is possible. At the beginning of April our friends became aware that Constantinople's days were numbered. There had been a very dramatic quarrel between the Doge Dandolo, erect at the prow of a galley, and Murzuphilus, who rebuked him from the shore, ordering the Latins to leave his lands. It was clear that Murzuphilus had gone mad and the Latins, if they chose, could swallow him with one gulp. Beyond the Golden Horn the preparations in the pilgrims' camp could clearly be seen, and on the decks of the ships at anchor there was a great bustle of sailors and men at arms making ready for the attack. Boide and Buandulino said that, since they had a bit of money, this was the moment to leave Constantinople, because, when it came to defeated cities, they had already seen more than enough. Boron and Kayat agreed, but the poet asked for a few more days. He had recovered from his setback and obviously wanted to exploit the last hours to make his final coup, though what that was he didn't even know himself. He was already beginning to have a madman's look in his eyes, but, of course, there's no arguing with madmen. They contented him, saying it was enough to keep an eye on the ships to understand when the moment came to head inland. The poet was gone for 2 days, and that was too long. In fact, on the Friday morning before Palm Sunday, he still hadn't come back and the pilgrims had begun to attack from the sea, between the Blachernay and the Evergete monastery, more or less in the area known as Petria, north of the walls of Constantine. It was too late to pass beyond the walls, now manned on all sides. Cursing their vagabond companion, Buandulino and the others decided it was better to lie low with the Genoese, because that district didn't seem threatened. They waited, and hour by hour they learned the news from Petria. The pilgrims' ships were bristling with obsidianal constructions. Murzuphilus was positioned on a little hill behind the walls with all his chiefs and courtiers, and banners, and trumpeters. Despite that show, the Imperials were fighting well. The Latins had essayed various assaults but had always been thrown back, with Greeklings cheering from the walls, and bearing their behinds to the defeated, while Murzuphilus swaggered as if he had done everything himself, ordering the trumpets to sound victory. Thus it seemed that Dandolo and the other leaders had given up the idea of taking the city, and Saturday and Sunday passed quietly, even though all remained tense. Buandulino seized the opportunity to comb Constantinople thoroughly, trying to find the poet, but in vain. It was Sunday night when their companion returned. His gaze was even wilder than before, he said nothing, and set to drinking silently until the next morning. It was at the first light of dawn on Monday that the pilgrims resumed the attack, which lasted all day. The ladders of the Venetian ships were successfully attached to some towers on the walls. The attackers entered. No, it had been only one, a giant, with a turreted helmet, who frightened the defenders and set them fleeing. Or else, some landed, found a bricked-up postern, destroyed it with blows of a pick, making a gap in the wall, yes, but they were driven back, though some towers had already been conquered. The poet paced back and forth in the room like a caged animal. He seemed anxious for the battle somehow to be resolved. He looked at Buandulino as if to tell him something, then gave up, and studied with grim eyes the movements of his other 3 comrades. At a certain point news came that Murzuphilus had fled, abandoning his army. The defenders had lost the little courage remaining to them. The pilgrims had broken through, past the walls. They didn't dare enter the city because darkness was falling, so they set fire to the first houses, to flush out any hidden defenders. The third fire, in the space of a few months, the Genoese groaned, but this isn't a city anymore, it's become a heap of dung to be burned when it's too high. Damn you, Boide shouted at the poet. If it hadn't been for you we'd have been out of this dunghill. What now? Now you shut up, and I know why. All right, the poet muttered to him. During the night the first glow from the fire was visible. At dawn Buandulino, who seemed to be sleeping, though his eyes were open, saw the poet approach first Boide, then Boron, and finally Kayat, and whisper something in each ear. Then he vanished. A little later Buandulino saw Kayat and Boron conferring, taking something from their packs before leaving the house, trying not to wake him. Still later, Boide came to him and shook his arm. He was aghast. Buandulino, he said, I don't know what's going on, but they're all crazy here. The poet came to me and said these very words. I found Zosimos, and now I know where the Grazel is. Don't try to be smart. Take your Baptist's head and be a catabates, in the place where Zosimos received the basileus that time, by this afternoon, you know the way. What's this catabates? What basileus was he talking about? Didn't he tell you anything? No, Buandulino said. On the contrary, it seems he wants to keep me in the dark. And he was so confused that he didn't remember it was Boron and Kayat who were with us, years ago, when we went to capture Zosimos at catabates, not you. Now I want to get a clear picture. He looked for Boimondo. Listen, he said to him, remember the evening, many years ago, when you took us to that crypt underneath the old monastery of Catabates? Now I have to go back there. If that's what you want, you have to reach that pavilion near the Church of the Holy Apostles. Maybe you can get there without finding the pilgrims, who probably haven't got there yet. If you come back, it will mean I'm right. Yes, but I should arrive there without arriving there. I mean, I can't explain it to you, but I have to follow, or proceed, someone who will take that same road, and I don't want to be seen. I remember there are many tunnels underneath. Can you get there by some other way? Boyamondo began laughing. If you're not afraid of the dead, you can enter from another pavilion near the hippodrome, and I think you can still get there from here. Then you proceed underground for quite a way, and you're in the cemetery of the monks of Catabates, which nobody knows still exists, but it does. The cemetery tunnels lead to the crypt, but if you like, you can stop before then. Will you take me? Buandulino, friendship is sacred, but my skin is even more sacred. I'll explain it all to you carefully. You're a smart boy and you'll find the way by yourself. All right? Boyamondo described the road to take, gave him also 2 well-resonated pieces of wood. Buandulino went back to Boidi and asked him if he was afraid of the dead. Not me, he said, I'm afraid only of the living. This is what we'll do, Buandulino said to him. You take your Baptist's head and I'll accompany you there. You'll go to your appointment and I'll hide a bit earlier to find out what that madman has on his mind. Let's go, Boidi said. At the moment they were leaving, Buandulino thought for an instant, then went back and took his own Baptist's head, which he wrapped in a rag, and put under his arm. Then he thought again, and into his belt he thrust the 2 Arab daggers he had bought at Gallipolis. 38. Buandulino settles scores. Buandulino and Boidi reached the hippodrome area as the flames of the fire were coming closer. They forced their way through a crowd of terrified Rami, who didn't know which way to escape, because some shouted that the pilgrims were coming from this direction, others from that. The 2 found the pavilion, forced a door locked by a weak chain, entered the underground passage, lighting the torches they had been given by Boyamondo. They walked for a long time, because obviously the passage led from the hippodrome to the walls of Constantine. Then they climbed some dank steps and began to smell a deathly stink. It wasn't the smell of recently dead flesh, it was, so to speak, the smell of a smell of flesh that had rotted and then somehow dried up. They entered a corridor, and could see others opening out to right and left along its course, in whose walls a series of niches opened, inhabited by a subterranean population of the almost living dead. They were dead, no doubt about that, those fully dressed beings, who stood erect in their recesses, supported perhaps by iron spikes that held their backs. But time seemed not to have completed its work of destruction, because those dry, leather-colored faces, in which empty sockets gaped, often marked by a toothless grin, gave an impression of life. They were not skeletons, but bodies apparently drained by a force that from inside had dried and crumbled the viscera, leaving intact not only the bones but also the skin, and perhaps part of the muscles. Master Nikitas, we had come upon a network of catacombs where for centuries the monks of Catabates had placed the corpses of their brothers, without burying them, because some miraculous conjunction of the soil, the air, and some substance that dripped from the tufa walls of that labyrinth preserved them almost intact. I thought they didn't do that anymore, and I didn't know anything about the Catabates cemetery, a sign that this city still retains some mysteries that none of us knows. But I had heard tell of how certain monks in the past, to assist the work of nature, let their brothers' corpses steep among the tufa humors for 8 months, then extracted them, washed them with vinegar, exposed them to the air for a few days, dressed them, and replaced them in their niches, so that somehow the balsamic air of that setting would ensure their dried immortality. Proceeding along that line of deceased monks, each dressed in liturgical vestments, as if they were still to officiate, kissing gleaming icons with their livid lips, Buandulino and Boidi glimpsed faces with taut, ascetic smiles, others to which the devout survivors had pasted beards and mustaches to make them look hieratic as in the past, their eyelids closed so they would seem asleep, still others with the head now reduced to a mere skull, but with hard, leathery bits of skin attached to the cheekbones. Some had been deformed by the centuries, and appeared like prodigies of nature, fetuses clumsily taken from the maternal womb, inhuman beings on whose contracted forms unnatural, arabesque chasubles appeared, the colors now dulled, dalmatics that you would have thought embroidered but were gnawed by the work of the years and by some worm of the catacombs. From still others the clothing had fallen, now crumbled by the centuries, and beneath the shreds of their vestments appeared scrawny little bodies, the ribs covered by an epidermis taut as the skin of a drum. If it was piety that conceived that sacred representation, Buandulino said to Nikitas, the survivors were impious, as they had imposed the memory of those deceased as a constant, looming threat, in no way meant to reconcile the living with death. How can you pray for the soul of someone who is staring at you from those walls, saying I am here, and I will never move from here? How can you hope for the resurrection of the flesh and the transfiguration of our earthly bodies after the last judgment, if those bodies are still there, decaying day after day? I, unfortunately, had seen corpses in my life, and at least I could hope that, dissolved into the earth, one day they might dazzle, beautiful and rubicund as a rose. If, up there on high, after the end of time, people like this would be moving about, I said to myself, then better hell that burns here and hacks there. In hell, at least it should resemble what happens in our world. Boidi, less sensitive than I to mortality, tried to lift those vestments to see the state of the pudenda, for if somebody shows you such things, how can you complain if somebody else thinks of those other things? Before the network of passages ended, they found themselves in a circular place, where the vault was perforated by an airshaft that revealed, up above, the afternoon sky. Obviously, at ground level, it well served to give air to that place. They put out the torches. No longer illuminated by the flames, but instead by that livid light diffused among the niches, the monks' bodies seemed even more disturbing. They gave the impression that, touched by daylight, they were about to rise again. Boydie made the sign of the cross. Finally, the corridor they had taken ended in the ambulacrum behind the columns that encircled the crypt where, the last time, they had seen Zosimos. Glimpsing some lights, they approached, on tiptoe. The crypt was as it had been before, illuminated by 2 lighted tripods. Only the circular basin used by Zosimos for his necromancy was missing. In front of the iconostasis Boron and Kayat were already waiting, nervous. Buandulino suggested to Boydie that he arrive, emerging between the 2 columns flanking the iconostasis, as if he had followed the same route, while Buandulino himself would remain hidden. Boydie did so, and the other 2 received him without surprise. "So the poet explained to you how to get here," Boron said. "We think he said nothing to Buandulino, otherwise why all the secrecy? Do you have any idea why he wants us to meet? He talked about Zosimos and the Grazel. He made some strange threats." "Us, too," Kayat and Boron agreed. They heard a voice, and it seemed to come from the pantocrator of the iconostasis. Buandulino noticed that the eyes of the Christ were 2 black almonds, a sign that behind the icon someone was watching what went on in the crypt. Though distorted, the voice was recognizable, and it was the poet's. "Welcome," the voice said. "You don't see me, but I see you. I am armed with a bow. I could easily shoot you before you can escape." "But why, poet? What have we done to you?" Boron asked, frightened. "What you have done you know better than I, but we must get to the point." "Enter, wretch." A stifled moan was heard, and from behind the iconostasis a groping form appeared. Though time had passed, though that man dragging himself forward was withered and bent, though his hair and beard had now become white, they recognized Zosimos. "Yes, it's Zosimos," the poet's voice said. "I came upon him yesterday, by pure chance, while he was begging in a lane. He's blind, his limbs are bent, but it's Zosimos. Now, Zosimos, tell our friends what happened to you when you fled from Ardzruni's castle." Zosimos, in a whining voice, began his narration. He had stolen the head in which he had hidden the Grazel, he had fled, but he had not only never possessed but had never seen any map of Cosmos, and he didn't know where to go. He wandered until his mule died, dragged himself through the most inhospitable lands of the world. His eyes, seared by the sun, now made him confuse east with west, and north with south. He happened upon a city inhabited by Christians, who succored him. He said he was the last of the Magi, because the others had achieved the peace of the Lord and lay in a church in the distant west. He said, in hieratic tone, that in the reliquary he was carrying the holy Grazel, to be delivered to Prester John. His hosts had somehow heard tell of both. They prostrated themselves before him, carried him in solemn procession into their church, where he began sitting on an episcopal seat, every day dispensing oracles, giving advice on the handling of things, eating and drinking his fill, surrounded by the respect of all. In short, as the last of the most holy kings, and keeper of the holy Grazel, he became the maximum spiritual authority of that community. Every morning he said Mass, and at the moment of the elevation, besides the sacred host, he displayed his reliquary, and the faithful knelt, saying they could smell celestial perfumes. The faithful also brought lost women to him, so he could lead them back to the straight path. He told them that God's mercy is infinite, and he summoned them to the church when evening had fallen, to spend with them, he said, the night in continuous prayer. Word spread that he had transformed those lost souls into so many Magdalens, who devoted themselves to his service. During the day they prepared for him the choicest foods, brought him the most exquisite wines, sprinkled him with scented oils. At night they kept vigil with him before the altar, Zosimos said, so the following morning he appeared with his eyes hollow from that penitence. Zosimos had finally found his paradise, and decided he would never leave that blessed place. Zosimos now heaved a long sigh, then passed his hands over his eyes, as if in that darkness he could still see a most painful scene. "My friends," he said, "whatever thought that comes to you, you must always ask it. Are you on our side or do you come from the enemy? I forgot to follow that holy maxim, and to the entire city I promised that, for Holy Easter, I would open the reliquary and finally display the Grazel. On Good Friday, alone, I opened the case, and in it I found one of those disgusting death's heads that Ardzruni had placed there. I swear I had hidden the Grazel in the first reliquary on the left, and that was the one I took before running away. But someone, surely one of you, had changed the order of the reliquaries, and the one I took didn't contain the Grazel. A man who is hammering an iron bar first thinks what he wants to make of it, a sickle, a sword, or an axe. I decided to remain silent. Father Agathon lived for 3 years with a stone in his mouth, until he was able to practice silence. So to all I said that I had been visited by an angel of the Lord, who had told me there were still too many sinners in the city, hence no one was yet worthy to see that holy object. The evening of Holy Saturday I spent, as every honest monk must, in mortifications, excessive, I think, because the next morning I felt exhausted, as if I had passed the night, God forgive me even the very thought, amid libations and fornications. I officiated, staggering, and, at the solemn moment when I was to display the reliquary to the devout, I stumbled on the top step of the altar, tumbling down. The reliquary slipped from my hands, and as it struck the ground, it opened, and all could see it contained no Grazel, but, rather, a dried-up skull. There is nothing more unjust than the punishment of the just man who has sinned, my friends, because the worst of sinners is forgiven the last of his crimes, but the just man is not even forgiven his first. Those devout people felt they had been defrauded by me, who until 3 days before, God is my witness, had acted in perfect good faith. They fell upon me, tore off my clothes, beat me with clubs that broke my legs forever, and my arms and back, then they dragged me into their tribunal, where they decided to tear out my eyes. They drove me out of the gates of the city, like a mangy cur. You don't know how much I suffered. I wandered, begging, blind and crippled. And crippled and blind, after long years of wandering, I was picked up by a caravan of Saracen merchants who were coming to Constantinople. The only pity I received was from the infidels, may God reward them and not damn them as they would deserve. I returned a few years ago to this my city, where I have lived by begging, and luckily a good soul one day led me by the hand to the ruins of this monastery, where I can recognize the places by touch, and since then I have been able to spend the nights without suffering the cold, the heat, or the rain. This is the story of Zosimos, the poet's voice said. His condition bears witness that, at least this once, he is sincere. So another one of you, seeing where Zosimos had hidden the Grazel, changed the position of the heads, to allow Zosimos to hasten to his ruin, and to deviate any suspicion. But he who has taken the correct head is the same who killed Frederick. And I know who it is. Poet, Coyote cried. Why are you saying this? Why have you summoned only us three, and not also buandulino? Why didn't you tell us anything up there at the house of the Genoese? I called you here because, through a city invaded by the enemy, I couldn't drag along with me this excuse for a man. Because I didn't want to speak in front of the Genoese, and especially not in front of buandulino. Buandulino is no longer a part of our story. One of you will give me the Grazel, and then the rest will be up to me. What makes you think buandulino doesn't have the Grazel? Buandulino can't have killed Frederick. He loved him. Buandulino had no interest in stealing the Grazel. He was the only one among us who really wanted to take it to the priest in the name of the emperor. Finally, try to remember what happened to the 6 heads that remained after Zosimos ran away. We took one each. I, Boran, Coyote, Boidi, Abdul, and buandulino. Yesterday, after I found Zosimos, I opened mine. Inside was a smoked skull. As for Abdul's, as you will recall, Ardruni had opened it to put the skull between his hands as an amulet, or whatever, at the moment Abdul was dying, and now it's with him in the grave. Buandulino gave his to Praxias. He opened it in front of us, and there was a skull inside. So 3 reliquaries remain, and those are yours. The 3 of you. Now I know which of you has the Grazel, and I know he knows. I also know that the possessor does not possess it by chance, but because he planned everything from the moment he killed Frederick. But I want him to have the courage to confess to us all that he has deceived us for years and years. After he has confessed, I will kill him. So make up your minds. Let him who must speak, speak. We have reached the end of our journey. Here something strange happens, Master Nikitas. From my hiding place, I was trying to put myself in the place of my 3 friends. Let us suppose that one of them, whom we will call Ego, knew he had the Grazel and was guilty of something. He would have told himself that, at this point, the best thing was to risk all, seize his sword or his dagger, dash off in the direction from which he had come, flee until he reached the cistern and then the sunlight. This, I believe, is what the poet was expecting. Perhaps he didn't yet know which of the 3 had the Grazel, but that escape would reveal it. Now let us imagine that Ego was not sure of having the Grazel, because he had never looked into his reliquary, and yet he did have something on his conscience concerning the death of Frederick. Ego therefore would have waited, to see if someone else who knew he had the Grazel would make a leap towards flight. Ego therefore was waiting, without making a move. But he could see that the others weren't moving either. So, he thought, none of them has the Grazel, and none of them feels he is at all worthy of suspicion. Therefore, he had to conclude, the one the poet has in mind is me, and I must escape. Puzzled, he put his hand to his sword, or dagger, and started to take a first step. But then he saw that each of the others was doing the same thing. He stopped again, suspecting that the other 2 felt more guilty than he. This is what happened in that crypt. Each of the 3, each thinking like the one I have called Ego, first remained still, then took one step, then stopped again. And this was the obvious sign that none of them was sure of having the Grazel, but that all 3 had something with which to reproach themselves. The poet understood this perfectly, and explained to them what I had understood and have now explained to you. The voice of the poet said, Wretches, all 3 of you. Each of you knows he is guilty. I know, I have always known, that all 3 of you tried to kill Frederick, and perhaps all 3 of you killed him, so the man died 3 times. That night I left the guardroom very early, and was the last to come back in. I was unable to sleep, perhaps I had had too much to drink. I urinated 3 times in the courtyard. I stayed outside so as not to disturb all of you. While I was outside, I heard Boran come out. He took the steps towards the lower level, and I followed him. He went into the room with the machines, approached the cylinder that produces the vacuum, worked its lever a number of times. I couldn't understand what he wanted, but I understood the next day. Either Ardruni had confided something to him, or he had understood on his own, but obviously the room in which the cylinder created the vacuum, the room in which the chicken had been sacrificed, was the very one where Frederick was sleeping, where Ardruni used to rid himself of the enemies he hypocritically received as guests. You, Boran, turned that lever until in the Emperor's room the vacuum had been created, or, at least, since you didn't believe in the vacuum, until that air was dense, where you knew candles were extinguished and animals were suffocated. Frederick felt unable to breathe. At first he thought of a poison, and took the grazel to drink the antidote it contained. But he fell to the ground lifeless. The next day you were ready to steal the grazel, exploiting the confusion, but Zosimos was ahead of you. You saw him, and you saw where he hid it. It was easy for you to change the position of the heads and, at the moment of leaving, you took the right one. Boron was covered with sweat. Poet, he said, you saw clearly. I was in the room with the pump. The debate with Ardzruni had aroused my curiosity. I tried to work it, not knowing, I swear, what room it affected. But, for that matter, I was convinced that the pump couldn't function. I gambled, true, but it was all in play, with no murderous intentions. And anyway, if I had done what you say I did, how can you explain the fact that in Frederick's room the wood in the fireplace had all burned to ashes? If the vacuum could actually be created, and kill someone, in the vacuum no flame would burn. Forget the fireplace, the stern voice of the poet said. For that there is another explanation. Just open your reliquary, if you're so sure it doesn't contain the grazel. Boron, muttering that God could strike him if he had ever had any thought of having the grazel, furiously cut the seal with his dagger, and from the case a skull rolled to the floor, smaller than those which had been seen so far, perhaps because Ardzruni had not hesitated to violate the graves even of children. You don't have the grazel. Very well, the poet's voice said, but this does not absolve you of what you have done. Now we come to you, Kayat. You went out just afterwards, with the manner of someone who needs some air. But you needed quite a lot, since you went all the way to the ramparts, where the mirrors of Archimedes were. I followed you, and I saw you. You touched them, you operated the short distance one, as Ardzruni had explained to us, you tilted it in a way that was not random, because you devoted great attention to it. You set the mirror so that, with the sun's first appearance, it would concentrate those rays on the window of Frederick's chamber. So it went, and those rays kindled the wood in the fireplace. By then the vacuum created by Boron had given way to new air, after so much time, and the flame could be fed. You knew what Frederick would do, waking half stifled by the smoke from the fireplace. He would believe himself poisoned and would drink from the grazel. I know, you also drank from it, that evening, but we didn't watch you carefully enough as you were replacing it in the ark. Somehow you had bought poison at the Gallipolese market, and you let a few drops fall into the cup. The plan was perfect, only you didn't know what Boron had done. Frederick had drunk from your poisoned cup, but not when the fire was kindled. It was much earlier, when Boron was cutting off his air. You're mad, poet, Kayat cried, pale as a corpse. I know nothing of the grazel. Look, now I'll open my head. Here, you see? There's a skull. No, you don't have the grazel. All right, the poet's voice said, but you don't deny having moved the mirrors. I wasn't feeling well, as you said, and I wanted to breathe the night air. I played with the mirrors, but may God strike me here and now if I knew they would light the fire in that room. You mustn't think that in these long years I have never thought of that imprudence of mine, wondering if it were not my fault that the fire was lighted and if this didn't have something to do with the Emperor's death. Years of horrible doubt. In a way you have relieved me, because you tell me that in any case at that point Frederick was already dead. But as for the poison, how can you say such an outrageous thing? That evening I drank in good faith, I felt like a sacrificial victim. You're all a flock of innocent lambs, innocent lambs who for 15 years have lived with the suspicion of having killed Frederick. Isn't that true also for you, Boron? But let's come to our beauty. At this point you're the only one who can have the grazel. That evening you didn't go outside. Like all the others, you found Frederick lying on the floor in his room the next morning. You weren't expecting it, but you seized the occasion. You had been brooding over it for some time. For that matter, you were the only one who had a reason to hate Frederick, who, before the walls of Alessandria, had killed so many of your companions. At Gallipolese you said you had bought that ring with cordial in its mount. But no one saw you while you were dealing with the merchant. Who can say it really contained a cordial? You had long been ready with your poison, and you realized this was the right moment. Perhaps, you thought, Frederick is only unconscious. You poured the poison into his mouth, saying you wanted to bring him round, and only afterwards, mind you, did Solomon realize he was dead. Poet, Boyd said, sinking to his knees, if you only knew how many times over these years I have asked myself if that cordial of mine was by chance poisonous. But now you tell me Frederick was already dead, killed by one of these two, or by both. Thank God. It doesn't matter, the poet's voice said, what matters is the intent. But as far as I'm concerned, you will answer to God for your intentions. I want only the grazel. Open the case. Boyd tried to open the reliquary, trembling. 3 times the sealing wax resisted his efforts. As he bent over that fatal receptacle, Boron and Kayat moved away from him, as if he were by now the designated victim. At his 4th try the case opened, and once again a skull appeared. By all the damned saints, the poet cried, emerging from behind the iconostasis. He was the very portrait of rage and madness, Master Nikitas, and I no longer recognized him as my old friend of the past. But at that moment I remembered the day when I went to look at the reliquaries, after Ardzruni had suggested we take them with us, and after Zosimos, unknown to us, had already hidden the grazel in one of them. I took a head in my hand, the first from the left if I recall properly, and I observed it carefully. Then I set it down. Now I was reliving that moment of almost 15 years before, and I saw myself as I placed the head to the right, the last of the 7. When Zosimos came down to flee with the Grazel, remembering he had put it in the first head to the left, he had taken that one, which was actually the second. When we divided the heads on leaving, I was the last to take mine. Obviously it was Zosimos's. You will remember that, not saying anything to the others, I had kept with me Abdul's head after his death. Later, when I gave one of the heads to Praxias, apparently I gave him Abdul's, and I realized it even then, because it opened easily, since the seal had already been broken by Ardzruni. So, for almost 15 years, I had carried the Grazel with me, not knowing it. By then I was so sure that I didn't even need to open my head. But I did, trying not to make any noise. Even behind the column in the darkness I could see that the Grazel was there, set in the case, with the cup facing forward and the base emerging, rounded like a skull. Now, as if he had been possessed by a demon, the poet was grabbing each of the other 3 by his clothes, covering them with insults, shouting that they were not to try to make a fool of him. Buandulino then left his reliquary behind the column and emerged from his hiding place. I am the one who has the Grazel, he said. The poet was taken by surprise. He blushed violently and said, "You've lied to us all this time. And I believed you were the purest of us all." "I haven't lied. I didn't know, not until this evening. You are the one who mistook the counting of the heads." The poet stretched his hands towards his friend and said, his mouth foaming, "Give it to me." "Why to you?" Buandulino asked. "The journey ends here," the poet repeated. "It has been an unfortunate journey and this is my last chance. Give it to me, or I'll kill you." Buandulino took a step back, clutching his hands around the hilts of his 2 Arabian daggers. "You would be capable of that. For this object you killed Frederick." "Nonsense," the poet said. "You just heard these 3 confess." 3 confessions are too many for one murder," Buandulino said. "I could say that, even if each of them had done what he said, you let them do it. It would have been enough if, when you saw that Boron was about to turn the vacuum lever, you had prevented him. It would have been enough if, when Kayat moved the mirrors, you had warned Frederick before sunrise. You didn't. You wanted someone to kill Frederick so you could then profit from it. But I don't believe that any of these 3 poor friends caused the death of the Emperor." Hearing you speak behind the iconostasis, I remembered the head of Medusa that made audible in Frederick's chamber what was being murmured in the stairwell below. "Now I will tell you what happened. Even before we set out on the expedition to Jerusalem, you were chomping at the bit and wanted to leave for the kingdom of the priest, with the Grazel, by yourself. You were only awaiting the right opportunity to be rid of the Emperor. Then, of course, we would have gone with you, but obviously for you we didn't represent a concern. Or perhaps you thought you could do what Zosimos, ahead of you, did. I don't know. For some time I should have realized that you were dreaming on your own, but friendship had clouded my intellect." "Go on." The poet sneered. "I will go on. In Gallipolis, when Solomon bought the antidote, I remember very well that the merchant offered us also an identical phial that, however, contained poison. Coming out of that emporium, we lost sight of you for a bit. Then you reappeared, but you were without money, and you told us you had been robbed. Instead, while we were wandering about the market, you had gone back there and bought the poison. It can't have been difficult for you to exchange Solomon's phial with yours, during the long journey through the land of the Sultan of Iconium. The evening before Frederick's death it was you who, in a loud voice, advised him to provide himself with the antidote. So you prompted our good Solomon, who offered his, or, rather, your, poison. You must have had a moment of terror when Kayat offered to taste it, but perhaps you already knew that the liquid, taken in a small dose, had no effect, and it was necessary to drink it all in order to die. I believe that during the night Kayat had such need of air because that tiny sip had upset him, but of this I'm not sure." "And what are you sure of?" the poet asked, still sneering. "I am sure that, before you saw Boron and Kayat in action, you already had your plan in mind. You went into the hall where the circular stair was, in whose central aperture one spoke to be heard in Frederick's room. For that matter, you yourself have demonstrated again this evening the fact that this game pleased you, and as I heard you speak from behind there, I began to understand. You approached the ear of Dionysus and called Frederick. I believe you passed yourself off as me, trusting in the fact that a voice, moving from one floor to another, would arrive distorted. You said you were me, to be more credible. You warned Frederick. We had discovered that someone had put poison in the food. Perhaps you said one of us was beginning to suffer horrible pains and Ardzruni had already unleashed his killers. You told him to open the ark and drink Solomon's antidote immediately. My poor father believed you, he drank, and he died. A fine story, the poet said. But what about the fireplace? Perhaps it really was kindled by the rays from the mirror, but only after Frederick was already a corpse. The fire had nothing to do with it, it was not a part of your plan, but whoever did kindle it helped you confuse the situation. You killed Frederick, and only now have you helped me understand it. Curse you. How could you commit this crime, this parricide against the man who was your benefactor, only out of your thirst for glory? Didn't you realize that you were once again stealing another's glory, as you had done with my poems? That's a fine one, Boydie said, laughing, having now recovered from his fear. The great poet had his poems written by somebody else. This humiliation, after the many frustrations of those days, along with the desperate determination to have the Grazel, drove the poet to his last excess. He drew his sword and flung himself on Buandulino, shouting, "I'll kill you. I'll kill you. I've always told you I was a man of peace, Master Nikitas." I was flattering myself. In reality, I'm a coward. Frederick was right that day. At that moment I hated the poet with all my soul. I wanted him dead, and yet I didn't think of killing him. I wanted only for him not to kill me. I leapt back towards the columns, then I took the passage by which I had come. I was escaping in the darkness, and I heard his threats as he chased me. The passage had no light. Groping your way ahead meant touching the corpses in the walls. When I came to a side passage to the left, I rushed in that direction. He followed the sound of my footsteps. Finally I saw a light, and I found myself below the shaft opening where I had passed before. It was now evening, and miraculously I saw the moon over my head, illuminating the place where I was, and casting silvery glints on the faces of the dead. Perhaps it was they who told me it is impossible to deceive your own death when it is panting at your heels. I stopped. I saw the poet arrive. He covered his eyes with his left hand, to block the sight of those unexpected guests. I grabbed one of the rotting robes and pulled hard. A corpse fell between me and the poet, raising a cloud of dust and of tiny cloth fragments that dissolved as they touched the ground. The head of that corpse had snapped from the trunk and rolled at the feet of my pursuer, directly under the moon's beam, displaying its horrid smile. The poet stopped for an instant, terrified, then he gave the skull a kick. On the other side, I grabbed two more cadavers, pushing them straight at his face. "Get this death away from me," the poet cried, as flakes of dried skin swirled around his head. I couldn't keep up that game forever. I would have fallen beyond the luminous circle and would have been plunged again into darkness. I clutched my two Arabian daggers in my hands, and held the blades straight out in front of me, like a beak. The poet flung himself against me, his sword raised, grasped with both hands, to slice my head in two, but he stumbled over the second skeleton, which had rolled in front of him. He attacked me. I fell to the ground, supporting myself on my elbows. He was upon me, while the sword slipped from his hands. I saw his face above mine, his bloodshot eyes above my eyes. I smelled the odor of his anger, the sweat of a beast as it claws its prey. I felt his hands clutch my neck. I heard the grinding of his teeth. I reacted instinctively. I raised my elbows and dealt him two blows, one on either side, against his flanks. I heard the sound of tearing cloth. I had the impression that, in the center of his viscera, the two blades met. Then I saw him blanch, and a trickle of blood came from his mouth. His brow touched mine. His blood dripped into my mouth. I don't remember how I extricated myself from that embrace. I left the daggers in his belly, and I shrugged aside that weight. He slipped to my side, his eyes open, staring at the moon high above, and he was dead. The first person you killed in your life. And, pray God, the last. He had been the friend of my youth, the companion of 1,000 adventures, for more than 40 years. I wanted to weep. Then I remembered what he had done, and I would have liked to kill him again. I stood up, with difficulty, because I had begun my killing when I no longer had the agility of my better years. I groped my way to the end of the passage, gasping, and re-entered the crypt. I saw the other three, pale and trembling. I felt myself invested again with my dignity as a ministerial and adoptive son of Frederick. I should not show any weakness. Erect, with my back to the iconostasis, as if I were an archangel among archangels, I said, "Justice is done. I have dealt death to the murderer of the Holy and Roman Emperor." Buandulino went to collect his reliquary, took out the grazel, showed it to the others, as if it were a consecrated host. He said only, "Does any one of you want to make a claim?" "Buandulino," Boron said, unable to keep his hands still, "I've lived more this evening than in all the years we've spent together. It is certainly not your fault, but something has broken between us, between me and you, between me and Kayat, between me and Boidi. Just now, if only for a few instants, each of us ardently wished that the guilty party were one of the others, to put an end to a nightmare. This is no longer friendship. After the fall of Bindapedzum we've remained together only by accident. What united us was the search for that object you were holding in your hand. The search, I say, not the object. Now I know that the object remained always with us, but this didn't prevent us from rushing again and again towards our destruction. I realized this evening that I must not have the grazel, or give it to anyone, but only keep alive the flame of the search for it. So you must keep that cup, which has the power of moving men only when it can't be found. I'm leaving. If I can get out of the city, I will, as soon as possible, and I will start writing about the grazel, and my only power will lie in my story. I will write of knights better than we, and my reader will dream of purity and not of our flaws. Farewell to all of you, my remaining friends. Not infrequently it has been beautiful to dream with you. He vanished along the way he had come. Buandulino, Kayat said, I believe Boron has made the best choice. I'm not learned, as he is. I don't know if I would be able to write the story of the grazel, but surely I'll find someone I can tell it to, so he can write it. Boron is right. I will remain faithful to my search of so many years if I can impel others to desire the grazel. I will not even speak of that cup you are holding in your hand. Perhaps I will say, as I said once, that the grazel is a stone, fallen from heaven. Stone, or cup, or spear. What does it matter? What counts is that nobody must find it, otherwise the others would stop seeking it. If you will listen to me, Hide that thing, so that no one will kill his own dream by putting his hands on it. And as for the rest, I too would feel uncomfortable moving among you. I would be overwhelmed by too many painful memories. You, buandulino, have become an avenging angel. Perhaps you had to do what you have done. But I don't want to see you again. Farewell. And he, too, went out of the crypt. Then Boide spoke, and after so many years he spoke again in the language of Freshetta. Buandulino, he said, I don't have my head in the clouds like those two, and I don't know how to tell stories. The idea of people going around looking for something that doesn't exist makes me laugh. The things that count are the things that do exist, only you mustn't let everybody see them because envy is a nasty beast. That cup there is something holy, believe me, because it's simple like all holy things. I don't know where you're going to put it, but any place, except the one I'm now going to say, would be the wrong one. Now listen to my idea. After your poor Papa Gagliardo died, bless his soul, you'll remember that everybody in Alessandria started saying if someone saves our city we'll raise a statue to him. Now you know how these things go. There's plenty of talk and nothing comes of it. But, going around selling grain, I found in a little crumbling church near Villa del Foro, a beautiful statue from God knows where. It's of a bent old man, holding his hands over his head with a kind of millstone resting on them, a construction stone, maybe, a great cheese wheel. Who knows what? And he seems to be bent double because he can hardly hold it up. I said to myself an image like that meant something, even if I didn't rightly know what it meant, but you know how it is. You make a statue and then others figure out what it means, whatever seems to work. Well, look at this. I said to myself then, this could be the statue of Gagliardo. You stick it over the door or on the side of the cathedral, like a little column with that stone on his head like a capital, and it's the spitting image of him bearing the weight of the whole siege. I carried it home and I put it in my barn. When I talked about it with others, everyone said it was a really good idea. Then there was the business when, if you were a good Christian, you set off for Jerusalem, so I went along with it, because it seemed like God knows what. What's done can be undone. Now I'm going home, and after all this time you'll see what a fuss they'll make over me, those of us who are still alive, and for the youngsters I'll be the one who followed the emperor to Jerusalem, and who has more stories to tell around the fire at evening than Master Virgil himself, so maybe before I die they'll even make me consul. I'm going home. Without saying anything to anyone, I'll go into the barn, find that statue, somehow I'll make a hole in that thing he has over his head, and I'll stick the grazel into it. Then I'll cover it with mortar, put back the stone chips so nobody can see even a crack, and I'll carry the statue into the cathedral. We'll set it up, fitting it nicely into the wall, and there it stays per omnia secula secularum, and nobody will pull it down, and nobody can see what your father is carrying on his head. We are a young city, and without too many bees in our bonnet, but the blessing of heaven can never harm anybody. I will die, my children will die, and the grazel will always be there, to protect the city, and nobody will know. It's enough if the good Lord knows. What do you say? Master Nikitas, that was the right fate for the cup, also because, though for years I had pretended to forget it, I was the only one who knew where it really came from. After what I had just done, I didn't know myself why I was in the world, since I had never done one thing right. With that grazel in my hands I would just have committed more mistakes. Good old Boide was right. I would have liked to go back with him, but what would I do in Alessandria among 1,000 memories of Calandrina, and dreaming of Hypatia every night? I thanked Boide for that beautiful idea. I wrapped the grazel in the rag I had brought it in, but without the reliquary. If you have to travel, and maybe come up against bandits, I said to him, a reliquary that looks like gold will be stolen at once, whereas they wouldn't even touch a common bowl. Go with God, Boide, may he help you always. Leave me here, for I need to remain alone. So he also left. I looked around, and I remembered Zosimos. He had gone. When he escaped I don't know, he had heard that one wanted to kill the other, and by then life had taught him to stay away from trouble. Groping, he who knew those places from memory, had slipped off, while we had quite different matters to occupy us. He had done all sorts of things, but he had been punished. Let him continue begging in the streets, and may the Lord have mercy on him. And so, Master Nikitas, I retraced my way along the corridor of the dead, stepping over the corpse of the poet, and I climbed back into the light of the fire near the hippodrome. What happened to me immediately afterwards you know. It was immediately afterwards that I met you. 39. Buandulino stylites. Nikitas was silent, and Buandulino, too, was silent, seated with his hands open on his lap. As if to say, that's all. There is something in your story, Nikitas said at a certain point, that doesn't convince me. The poet formulated imaginary accusations against your companions, as if each of them had killed Frederick, and then they were false. You believed you could reconstruct what happened that night, but if you have told me everything, the poet never said that was how things really went. He tried to kill me. He had gone crazy, that is clear. He wanted the grazel at any price, and to have it he had convinced himself that its possessor was the murderer. All he could think of you was that, having it, you had kept it hidden from him, and this was enough for him to pass over your dead body to take that cup from you. But you never said that he was the murderer of Frederick. Well, who was it then? You all went on for 15 years thinking that Frederick's death was a pure accident. We stuck to that belief so that we wouldn't have to suspect one another. And then there was the ghost of Zosimos. We had a guilty party. That may be. But, believe me, and I am a man who in imperial palaces has witnessed many crimes. Even if our emperors always enjoyed showing foreign visitors strange machines and miraculous automata, I never saw anyone use those machines to kill. Listen. You will remember that when you mentioned Ardruni to me the first time, I said I had known him in Constantinople, and that one of my friends from Selymbria had been to his castle once or twice. He is a man, this Paphnutius, who knows much about Ardruni's diabolic tricks, because he himself has constructed similar things for the imperial palaces. And he knows well the limitations of these deviltries, because once, in the days of Andronicus, he promised the emperor an automaton that would spin in place and unfurl a banner when the emperor clapped his hands. He constructed it, Andronicus displayed it to some foreign envoys during a banquet, he clapped his hands, the automaton didn't budge, and Paphnutius's eyes were gouged out. I'll ask him if he would like to come and pay you a visit. Actually, exiled here in Selymbria, he is bored. Paphnutius came, led by a boy. Despite his misfortune and his age, he was a keen and lively man. He conversed with Nikitas, whom he hadn't seen for some time, and then asked how he could be of help to Buandulino. Buandulino told him the story, first summarily, then in greater detail, from the Gallipolese market to the death of Frederick. He couldn't avoid referring to Ardruni, but he concealed the identity of his adoptive father, saying he was a Flemish count, very dear to him. He didn't even mention the Grazel, but spoke only of a goblet studded with precious stones, to which the murdered man was greatly attached, a thing that could arouse the envy of many. As Buandulino narrated, Paphnutius interrupted him every now and then. "You're a Frank, aren't you?" he asked, and explained that his way of pronouncing certain Greek words was typical of those who lived in Provence. Or, "Why do you keep touching that scar on your cheek while you talk?" And to Buandulino, who by now believed his blindness was counterfeit, he explained that at times his voice lost its sonority, as if he were passing his hand before his mouth. If, as many do, he were touching his beard, he wouldn't have covered his mouth. Therefore he must be touching his cheek, and if someone touches his cheek it's because he has a toothache, or has a wart or a scar. Since Buandulino was a man of arms, the scar hypothesis seemed the most rational. Buandulino completed his tale, and Paphnutius said, "Now you would like to know what really happened inside the locked room of the Emperor Frederick. How do you know I was talking about Frederick? Come now, everyone knows the emperor drowned in the Calicanus, a few feet from the castle of Ardruni, who, for that matter, then immediately disappeared, because his prince Leo wanted to chop off his head, holding him responsible for not having guarded adequately that most illustrious guest. I had always been amazed that your emperor, so accustomed to swimming in rivers, as everyone said, had let himself be swept away by the current of a trickle like the Calicanus, and now you are explaining many things to me. So then, let's try to see this clearly." He spoke without irony, as if he were truly following a scene that was unfolding before his spent eyes. First of all, we can eliminate any suspicion that Frederick died because of the machine that creates the vacuum. I know that machine. First of all, it acted on a small windowless room on the upper floor, and not surely in the room of the emperor, where there was a flue and God knows how many other apertures where air could enter at will. In second place, the machine itself couldn't work. I tested it. The inner cylinder didn't occupy perfectly the outer cylinder, and there, too, air could come in all over the place. Mechanics more expert than Ardruni tried, centuries and centuries ago, experiments of the kind, without results. It was one thing to construct the sphere that turned or the gate that opened thanks to heat. These are tricks known since the times of Ctesibius and Hero of Alexandria. But the vacuum, dear friend, absolutely not. Ardruni was vain, he liked to amaze his guests, and that's all there was to it. Now we come to the mirrors. The burning of the Roman ships by the great Archimedes is consecrated by legend, but we don't know if it's true. I've touched Ardruni's mirrors. They were too small and crudely ground. Even assuming they were perfect, one mirror sends solar rays of some power at high noon, not in the morning, when the sun's rays are weak. Moreover, the rays would have had to pass through a window with colored panes, and so you see that your friend, even if he had trained one of those mirrors on the emperor's chamber, would have achieved nothing. Are you convinced? Let's move on to the rest. Poisons and antidotes. You Latins are truly ingenious. Could you imagine that in the Gallipolese market they could sell potent substances such as even a basilisk can manage to possess only through trusted alchemists, paying their weight in gold? Everything sold there is false. It serves for the barbarians who come from Iconium or the Bulgar forest. In the two phials they showed you was fresh water, and whether Frederick drank the liquid from the phial belonging to your Jewish friend or from the one belonging to your friend called the poet, the result would have been the same. And the same can be said for the portentous cordial. If such a cordial were to exist, every strategist would stock up on it, to animate and drive his wounded soldiers back into battle. For that matter, you told me the price at which they sold you those marvels. It was so ridiculous that it was hardly worth the trouble to take the water from the fountain and fill the phials. Now let me tell you about the Dionysus ear. I have never heard that Ardruni's device worked. Tricks of this kind can succeed when the distance between the aperture into which you speak and the one from which the voice emerges is very short, as when you cup your hands around your mouth, to make yourself heard a bit farther away. But in the castle, the passage from one floor to the next was complicated, twisting and winding, between thick walls. Did Ardruni allow you to test his device? No, you see? He showed it to his guests, he boasted of it, and that's all. Even if your poet had tried to speak with Frederick, and Frederick had been awake, he would have heard at most a vague mumbling from the Medusa's mouth. Perhaps sometimes Ardruni used this artifice to frighten someone he had sent to sleep up there, to make him believe the castle housed ghosts, but no more than that. Your poet friend can't have sent any message to Frederick. But the empty cup on the floor, the fire in the fireplace. You told me that Frederick didn't feel well that evening. He had ridden all day under the sun of those lands, which burns and is bad for those who are not used to it. He had spent days and days in battle and incessant peregrinations. He was surely tired, weak, perhaps he was seized by a fever. What do you do if you feel chills during the night? You try to cover yourself up, but, if you have fever, you feel the chills even under the blankets. Your emperor lighted the fire. Then he felt still worse. He was gripped by the fear of having been poisoned, and he drank his useless antidote. But why did he feel still worse? There I'm no longer certain, but if you think rationally, it's obvious there can be only one conclusion. Describe that fireplace to me again, so that I can see it well. There was some wood on a bed of dry twigs, there were some boughs with aromatic berries, and then chunks of a dark substance. I believe it was charcoal, but covered by something oily. It was naphtha or bitumen, which is found, for example, abundantly in Palestine, in the sea they call Dead, where they believe water is so dense and heavy that if you enter that sea you don't sink, but float like a boat. Pliny writes that this substance is so kin to fire that when it approaches wood, it kindles it. As for the charcoal, we all know what it is if, as Pliny says, it is derived from oaks, by burning some fresh boughs in a cone-heaped pile, sheathed in damp clay, in which some holes have been made to release all the humidity during the combustion. But sometimes it is made from other woods, whose virtues we do not always know. Now many physicians have observed what happens to one who inhales the fumes of a bad charcoal made even more dangerous by its union with certain types of bitumen. It gives off poisonous gases, far more subtle and invisible than the smoke normally emitted by a lighted fire, which you try to dispel by opening the window. You don't see these fumes. They spread and, if the space is closed, they stagnate. You could become aware of them because, when they come in contact with the flame of a lamp, they color it blue. But generally when one does become aware, it is too late. That maleficent breath has already devoured the pure air around him. The unfortunate who inhales the mephitic air feels a great heaviness of the head, a ringing in the ears, his breath becomes labored, and his sight is clouded. Good reasons to believe you've been poisoned, and to drink an antidote, and this is what your emperor did. After you have realized these symptoms, if you don't immediately leave the infected place, or someone doesn't drag you away, worse happens. You feel overcome by an immense drowsiness, you fall to the ground, and to the eyes of whoever finds you, you will seem dead, not breathing, without bodily warmth, no pulse, your limbs stiffened, and an extreme pallor on your face. Even the most expert doctor will think he is seeing a corpse. We know of people who have been buried in this condition, whereas it would have sufficed to treat them with cold cloths on the head and foot baths, rubbing the whole body with oils that stimulate the humors. You, Buandulino said, his face as pale as Frederick's that morning, you are telling me that we believed the emperor dead, and he was alive? Almost certainly yes, my poor friend. He died when he was thrown into the river. The icy water somehow began to revive him, and that too would have been a good treatment, but, still unconscious, he started breathing, swallowed the water, and drowned. When you pulled him to shore, you should have seen if he had the look of a drowned man. He was bloated. I knew it couldn't be so, and I thought it was an impression, from the sight of those poor remains scratched by the stones of the river. A dead man doesn't become bloated remaining underwater. It happens only to a living man who dies underwater. Then Frederick fell victim to an extraordinary and unknown fit, and wasn't killed? His life was taken, to be sure, but by whoever threw him into the water. But I did that. It is truly a shame. I can hear that you are distressed. Calm yourself. You acted, believing you were doing good, and surely not to cause his death. I did cause him to die. I do not call this killing. But I do, Buandulino cried. I drowned my poor father while he was still alive, He turned even more pale, murmured a few disjointed words, and fainted. He came to as Nikitas was putting cold cloths on his head. Paphnutius had left, perhaps feeling guilty for having revealed to Buandulino, to show how well he could see things, a terrible truth. Now try to remain calm, Nikitas said to him. I understand that you are distraught, but it was an accident. You heard Paphnutius. Anyone would have thought the man was dead. I too have heard of cases of apparent death that deceived every doctor. I killed my father, Buandulino kept repeating, shaken now by a feverish tremor, unknowing. I hated him, because I had desired his wife, my adoptive mother. I was first an adulterer, then a parricide, and carrying this leprosy in me, I befouled with my incestuous seed the purest of virgins, making her believe that that was the ecstasy I had promised her. I'm a murderer, because I killed the poet, who was innocent. He was not innocent, he was driven by a relentless desire, he was trying to kill you, you defended yourself. I accused him unjustly of the murder I myself had committed, I killed him rather than recognize that I should punish myself. I have lived my whole life in falsehood, I want to die, to plunge into hell and suffer for all eternity. It was futile to try to calm him, and nothing could be done to heal him. Nikitas had Theophylactus prepare an infusion of somniferous herbs and made Buandulino drink it. A few minutes later Buandulino sank into the most restless sleep. When he woke up the next day, he refused the cup of broth that was offered him, went outside, sat under a tree and there remained in silence, his head in his hands, for the whole day, and the next morning he was still there. Nikitas decided that in such cases the best remedy is wine, and convinced him to drink wine in abundance, as if it were a medicine. Buandulino remained in a state of continuous torpor under the tree for 3 days and 3 nights. At dawn of the 4th morning Nikitas went to look for him, and he was gone. He searched the garden thoroughly and the house, but Buandulino had vanished. Fearing he might have decided to commit a desperate act, Nikitas sent Theophylactus and his children to look for him through all Selymbria and in the surrounding fields. 2 hours later they returned, shouting to Nikitas to come and see. They took him to that meadow just outside the city where, entering, they had seen the column of the eremites of the past. A group of curious bystanders had collected at the foot of the column, pointing upwards. The column was of white stone, almost as tall as a 2-story house. At the top it widened into a square balcony, surrounded by a parapet made of rough posts and a banister, also in stone. A little pavilion stood in the center. The space extending from the column was very scant. To be seated on the balcony, one had to allow one's legs to dangle, and the pavilion could barely contain a crouching, huddled man. His legs hanging, Buandulino was seated up there, and it could be seen that he was naked as a worm. Nikitas called him, shouted to him to come down, tried to open the little door at the foot of the column that, as in all similar constructions, opened on a circular staircase that led up to the balcony. But the door, though shaky, had been barred from inside. "Come down, Buandulino. What are you doing up there?" Buandulino answered, but Nikitas couldn't hear clearly. He asked others to go and find him a sufficiently high ladder. He was given one, he painfully climbed it, and found himself with his head against Buandulino's feet. "What do you want to do?" he asked again. "Stay here. Now my expiation begins. I will pray, I will meditate, I will annihilate myself in silence. I will try to achieve a solitary distance from every opinion and imagination, to feel neither wrath nor desire, nor even reasoning or thought, to free myself from every bond, to return to the absolutely simple so as no longer to see anything, except the glory of darkness. I will drain soul and intellect, I will arrive beyond the kingdom of the mind. In the darkness I will complete my journey along paths of fire." Nikitas realized Buandulino was repeating things heard from Hypatia. To such a degree this unhappy man wished to flee every passion, he thought, that he is isolated up here seeking to become equal to her whom he still loves. But Nikitas didn't say this. He asked only how Buandulino thought to survive. "You told me that the eremites lowered a basket on a string," Buandulino said, "and the faithful placed there as alms the scraps left from their table, or, better still, left uneaten by their animals. And a bit of water, even if it is possible to suffer thirst and wait until, now and then, the rain falls." Nikitas sighed, climbed down, had someone find a basket with a string, filled it with bread, cooked greens, olives, and pieces of meat. One of Theophylactus's sons threw the string up, Buandulino caught it, and drew up the basket. He took only the bread and olives, and gave back the rest. "Now leave me, I beg you," he cried to Nikitas. "What I wanted to understand, telling you my story, I have understood. We have nothing more to say to each other. Thank you for having helped me arrive where I am." Nikitas went to see him every day. Buandulino greeted him with a gesture, and remained silent. As time went by, Nikitas realized it was no longer necessary to take him food, because word had spread in Selymbria that, after centuries, another holy man had isolated himself on top of a column, and everyone went there, to stand below and bless himself, putting in the basket something to eat and drink. Buandulino pulled up the string, kept for himself what little he needed for that day, and crumbled the rest for the many birds that had taken to perching on the banister. They were his only interest. Buandulino stayed up there all summer without uttering a word, burned by the sun, and though he often withdrew into the pavilion, tortured by the heat. He defecated and urinated obviously at night, over the balustrade, and his feces could be seen at the foot of the column, tiny as a goat's. His beard and hair kept growing, and he was so dirty that it could be seen and, also was beginning to be smelled, from down below. Nikitas twice had to be absent from Selymbria. In Constantinople, Baudouin of Flanders had been named Basileus, and the Latins were little by little invading the whole empire, but Nikitas had to look after his property. Meanwhile, in Nicaea, the last bulwark of the Byzantine Empire was being constructed, and Nikitas was thinking he should move there, where they would need a counselor of his experience. Therefore it was necessary to make approaches and prepare for that new, very dangerous journey. Every time he came back, he saw an ever thicker crowd at the foot of the column. Some had thought that a stylite, so purified by his constant sacrifice, could not help but possess profound wisdom, and they would climb the ladder to ask his advice and solace. They told him of their misfortunes, and Buandulino would answer, for example, "If you are proud, you are the devil. If you are sad, you are his son. And if you worry over 1,000 things, you are his never-resting servant." Another asked his advice on settling a dispute with his neighbor. And Buandulino said, "Be like a camel. Bear the burden of your sins, and follow the steps of him who knows the ways of the Lord." Yet another complained that his daughter-in-law could not bear a child. And Buandulino said, "Everything a man can think about, what is under the sun and what is above the sky, is vain. Only he who perseveres in the memory of Christ is in the truth." "How wise he is," they said, and left him a few coins, going off, filled with consolation. Winter came, and Buandulino was almost always huddled inside the pavilion. Rather than listen to long stories from those who came to him, he began foreseeing them. You love a person with all your heart, but at times you are overcome with the suspicion that this person does not love you with equal warmth, he would say. And the visitor would say, how right you are. You have read my soul like an open book. What must I do? And buandulino would say, be silent and do not measure yourself. To a fat man, who arrived after climbing up with great effort, he said, you wake every morning with an aching neck, and you have trouble pulling on your boots. That's right, the man said, with wonder. And buandulino said, don't eat for 3 days. But do not take pride in your fasting. Rather than become proud, eat meat. It is better to eat than to boast. And accept your pains as a toll for your sins. A father came and told him that his son was covered with painful sores. Buandulino answered, wash him 3 times a day with water and salt, and each time say the words, Virgin Hypatia, take care of your child. The man went off, and a week later he came back, saying the sores were healing. He gave buandulino some coins, a pigeon, and a flask of wine. All cried miracle, and the sick went to the church, praying, Virgin Hypatia, take care of your child. A poorly dressed man with a grim face climbed the ladder. Buandulino said to him, I know what's wrong with you. In your heart you bear rancor towards someone. You know everything, the man said. Buandulino said to him, if someone wants to return evil for evil, he can hurt a brother with the simplest gesture. Keep your hands always behind your back. Another came with sad eyes and said to him, I don't know what my sickness is. I know, Buandulino said. You are slothful. How can I be cured? Sloth appears the first time when you notice the slowness of the movement of the sun. And then, never look at the sun. Nothing can be hidden from him, the people of Selembria were saying. How can you be so wise? One man asked him. And buandulino said, because I hide myself. How can you hide yourself? Buandulino held out his hand and showed his palm. What do you see before you? He asked. A hand, the man answered. You see I know well how to hide myself, Buandulino said. Spring returned. Buandulino was increasingly dirty and hairy. He was covered with birds, who swarmed to peck the worms that had begun to inhabit his body. Since he had to nourish all those creatures, people filled his basket frequently during the day. One morning a man on horseback arrived, breathless and covered with dust. He said that, during a hunting party, a nobleman had clumsily shot an arrow and had struck the son of his sister. The arrow had entered the son's eye and had come out from his nape. The boy was still breathing, and that nobleman asked Buandulino to do whatever could be done by a man of God. Buandulino said, the task of the stylite is to see his thoughts arrive from the distance. I knew you would come, but you have taken too much time, and you will take just as long to go back. Things in this world go as they must go. I must tell you that the boy is dying at this moment, or rather, he is already dead. May God have mercy on him. The knight went home, and the boy was already dead. When the news was known, many in Selembria cried that Buandulino had the gift of clairvoyance and had seen what was happening miles away. But not far from the column there was the church of St. Mardonius, whose priest hated Buandulino, because for months the offerings of his regular parishioners had been diminishing. This priest took to saying that Buandulino's miracle didn't amount to much. Anybody could work such miracles. He went to the foot of the column and shouted to Buandulino that, if a stylite wasn't even capable of removing an arrow from an eye, it was as if he had killed the boy himself. Buandulino answered, concern with pleasing humans causes the loss of all spiritual growth. The priest threw a stone at him, and immediately some other fanatics joined in flinging stones and clods at the balcony. They hurled stones all day, as Buandulino huddled in the pavilion, his hands over his face. They went off only when night had fallen. The next morning Nikitas went to see what had happened to his friend, but never saw him there again. The column was deserted. He went home, uneasy, and found Buandulino in Theophylactus's room. He had filled a barrel with water, and with a knife he was scraping away all the filth he had accumulated. He had roughly cut his beard and hair. He was tanned by the sun and the wind. He didn't seem to have lost much weight, but it was hard for him to remain erect, and he moved his arms and shoulders to loosen the muscles of his back. You saw for yourself. The one time in my life I told the truth and only the truth, they stoned me. It happened also to the apostles. You had become a holy man, and you let such a little thing discourage you? Maybe I was expecting a sign from heaven. Over these months I have accumulated no small number of coins. I sent one of Theophylactus's sons to buy me some clothes, a horse, and a mule. My weapons must still be somewhere around this house. So you are going away? Yes, he said, staying on that column. I have come to understand many things. I have understood that I sinned, but never to achieve power and wealth. I understand that, if I want to be forgiven, I must pay 3 debts. First debt. I promised to have a stone raised to commemorate Abdul, and for this I kept his Baptist's head. The money has come from elsewhere, and that is better, because it hasn't come from simony but from the donations of good Christians. I will find again the place where we buried Abdul, and I will have a chapel built. But you don't even remember where he was killed. God will guide me, and I know the map of Cosmos from memory. Second debt. I made a sacred promise to my good father Frederick, not to mention to Bishop Otto, and until now I haven't kept it. I must reach the kingdom of Prester John. Otherwise I will have spent my life in vain. But you have had living proof that it doesn't exist. We had proof that we hadn't reached it. That's different, but you realized that the eunuchs were lying. That perhaps they were lying. But Bishop Otto could not lie, or the voice of tradition, which declares the priest is somewhere. But you are no longer young as when you tried the first time. I am wiser. Third debt. I have a son, or a daughter, back there. And Hypatia is there. I want to find them, and protect them, as is my duty. But more than 7 years have passed. The child will now be over 6. Is a child of 6 perhaps no longer one's child? But it could be a male, and therefore a satyr that is never seen. And it could be a little Hypatia. I will love that child in any case. But you don't know where the mountains are, the place where they have taken refuge. I will search for them. But Hypatia could have forgotten you. Perhaps she won't want to see again the man with whom she lost her apathy. You don't know Hypatia. She is waiting for me. But you were already old when she loved you. Now you will seem ancient to her. She has never seen younger men. But it will take you years and years to go back to those places, and to go beyond. We people of Freshetta have heads harder than birds. But how do you know you will live to the end of your journey? A journey makes you younger. There was nothing to be done. The next day Buandulino embraced Nikitas, his whole family, and his hosts. With some effort, he mounted his horse, leading behind him a mule with many provisions, his sword hanging from his saddle. Nikitas saw him disappear into the distance, still waving his hand, but not looking back, heading straight for the kingdom of Prester John. 40. Buandulino is no more. Nikitas went to visit Paphnutius. He told him everything, from start to finish, from the moment he encountered Buandulino in St. Sophia, and everything Buandulino had narrated to him. What must I do? He asked. For him? Nothing. He is going towards his destiny. Not for him, for myself. I am a writer of histories. Sooner or later I will have to set myself to putting down the record of the last days of Byzantium. Where will I put the story that Buandulino told me? Nowhere. The story is all his. And anyway, are you sure it is true? No, everything I know I have learned from him, as from him I learned that he was a liar. Then you see, the wise Paphnutius said, that a writer of histories cannot put his faith in such uncertain testimony. Strike Buandulino from your story. But at least during the last days we had a story in common, in the house of the Genoese. Strike also the Genoese. Otherwise you'd have to tell about the relics they fabricated, and your readers would lose faith in the most sacred things. It won't cost you much to alter events slightly. You will say you were helped by some Venetians. Yes, I know, it's not the truth, but in a great history little truths can be altered so that the greater truth emerges. You must tell the true story of the empire of the Romans, not a little adventure that was born in a far-off swamp, in barbarian lands, among barbarian peoples. And, further, would you like to put into the heads of your future readers the notion that a Grazel exists, up there amid the snow and ice, and the kingdom of Prester John in the remote lands? Who knows how many lunatics would start wandering endlessly, for centuries and centuries. It was a beautiful story. Too bad no one will find out about it. You surely don't believe you're the only writer of stories in this world. Sooner or later, someone, a greater liar than Buandulino, will tell it. Translator's note. As always, and with undiminished gratitude, I want to thank the author for his generous and invaluable assistance, and our editor, Drenka Willen, for her sensitive reading of the text and her cogent suggestions and stimulating questions. I owe a great deal also to my friends at Bard College, my colleagues Bruce Chilton, Frederick Hammond, Robert Kelly, William Mullen, Karen Sullivan, and my former students Ezra Lichtenstein and Jorge Santana, who cheerfully tamed my recalcitrant computer. W. Reading Group Guide. 1. Who is narrating the first chapter of this novel? What scenes, characters, and events described here show up later in the narrative? Consider this passage, near the end of the chapter. I said to him, when you learn to read, then you learn everything you didn't know before. But when you write only what you know already, so patiently I am better off not knowing how to write. How does this passage exemplify the novel's complex if not conflicted treatment of self-expression and communication, written, verbal, and so on? 2. One of the few constants in this brisk, far-flung, and episodic adventure story is Buandulino's predilection to stretch the truth, rearrange the facts, fib, lie. What ironic points might Eco be making about the links between falsehood and history? Should all of history, in effect, be understood as historical fiction? What are the little truths and the greater truth mentioned in Chapter 40? 3. Compare and contrast Buandulino's two father figures. What sort of life does each man lead? How does each man die? What does each impart or pass on to Buandulino, physically, emotionally, and spiritually? 4. Discuss how, if at all, Buandulino the character both embodies and transcends the many paradoxes at work in Buandulino the novel. Sacred and profane experiences, high and low vocabularies, royal and common families, real and imagined miracles, etc. 5. Acknowledging this novel's many and various literary allusions, one reviewer described its protagonist as a resourceful cross between Voltaire's Candide and Thomas Berger's Little Big Man. But what mythic traits, if any, did you identify in the character of Buandulino? How did he echo, for example, the questing hero? The trickster fool? Any others? 6. What is the green honey that appears at several points in this novel? What does it do? Why is it so prized or disdained? And how does it relate to the novel's core struggle between illusion and reality? 7. The limits of my language means the limits of my world, the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein once remarked. Given Baudolino's almost superhuman ability to learn any language, how would you label or define the limits of his world? 8. Who is Nikitas? What dramatic and conceptual roles does he play in this novel? Explain how he influences and participates in the story Baudolino is telling, or doesn't he? How does the journey Nikitas is making thematically relate to the journey Baudolino is describing? What is the single thing Nikitas chooses to believe regarding Baudolino's tale? See chapter 26. And is this single thing true or correct? 9. Discuss Baudolino as a mystery story. What, in your view, are its defining questions? Why is Baudolino forced to kill the poet in chapter 38, and why, a few pages later, does Kayat tell Baudolino, regarding the Grazel, what counts is that nobody must find it? And which of the key queries in Baudolino remain unsolved? 10. Review the last 2 chapters of this novel. What happens to our hero in these final pages? How and why does Baudolino change at the end of the novel? How and why does he stay the same? Explore the question of whether Baudolino is ultimately a tragic or comic tale.